a woman on her knees in the mud, both hands bleeding, a storm tearing apart everything she'd spent 3 weeks rowing. She didn't move not because she couldn't, because she was still building the mound higher, still pressing the earth firm around the roots while the glass cut deeper and the rain washed the blood pink and then away. Somewhere behind her, a man watched through a kitchen window and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a woman who had already decided. This is the Texas prairie, 1882. A place where the land keeps no promises and the law protects no one it doesn't feel like protecting. A place where a woman arrived with a carpet bag, a rifle, and 7 words on a piece of paper that ended everything she'd traveled 1,500 miles to find what she built next. Nobody saw coming. Now I want to tell you about a woman named Hattie Bowman and how she came to build something lasting from pure nothing on the Texas prairie of 1882. She showed up with bleeding hands and a rifle and started building before anyone thought to offer help. And when help arrived, she didn't put the hammer down. She made room for another pair of hands and kept going. Not a grand adventure, not a rescue. Something harder than both. The kind of story where the woman shows up with a carpet bag and 7 words on a piece of paper and turns both into the foundation of everything she'd been looking for since the law took the last thing she owned. That's the story. That's Hattie. Let's begin where it actually began. Not with romance, not with the cowboy, but with the stagecoach driver who wouldn't meet her eyes. He whipped his horses before she finished reading. 7 words. That's all it took to undo 14 months of letters, of careful hope, of $347 sewn into the lining of her corset with her mother's needle, because a woman traveling alone in 1882 didn't carry her savings where anyone could see them. Found myself a local girl. Don't come. No name at the bottom. Holt Briggs hadn't even signed it. Hattie Bowman stood on the platform at Caldwell Station and read those 7 words 3 times. Not because she didn't understand them. She understood them perfectly on the first pass. She read them 3 times because she was deciding something. Not about Holt Briggs. He'd already made himself irrelevant. She was deciding about herself, 31 years old. A widow twice over in the ways that counted. Once when Thomas Hale died of typhoid in Springfield, Illinois, and once 3 weeks later when Thomas's brother arrived with a lawyer and a document explaining, in careful legal language, that a wife without children held no claim to her husband's estate under Illinois law. The farm was gone. The house was gone. The set of blue china her mother-in-law had brought from her own mother's kitchen was gone. What remained was the Winchester her father had taught her to shoot, the leather-bound ledger her mother had kept for 30 years before passing it to her, and the $347 she'd spent 8 months saving from bookkeeping work for the Miller family in Springfield. She hadn't cried then either. Crying was a luxury for people who had time to stop moving. The platform at Caldwell was mostly empty on a Tuesday afternoon. A dry goods wagon at the far end. 2 old men playing cards in the shade of the station house. A dog asleep in a patch of sun that was doing nobody any favors at this hour. The air tasted like dust and something metallic underneath, the way Texas air did. Like the land was always just barely keeping something contained. Hattie folded the paper, put it in her pocket, picked up her carpet bag. 1 dress, 1 working outfit. Undergarments, her mother's ledger, a box of Winchester cartridges, and a photograph of Thomas she kept because she wasn't the kind of person who threw things away just because they hurt. Then she looked west, not at anything in particular, just west, where the prairie opened past the last building on Main Street into something that had no ceiling and no walls and no brother-in-law with a lawyer. What on this land has no one claimed? That was the thought. Not despair, not anger, pure, practical curiosity from a woman who had kept books long enough to know that unclaimed things weren't unclaimed because they lacked value. They were unclaimed because nobody had looked at them right yet. She walked to Mrs. Alcott's boarding house on Main Street, paid 50 cents for a room, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her ledger open in her lap 3 nights. That's what she could afford without working. After that, the good Lord would have to provide. And Hattie had long ago decided that what her mother meant by that was not divine intervention, but the practical application of whatever skills God had seen fit to give you. She opened the ledger to a clean page, drew a line down the center, left column what she had, right column what she needed, left $347, Winchester model 1873, 1 box of cartridges, 8 years of bookkeeping across 2 households and 1 business. Knowledge of basic carpentry from watching her father build their barn in Ohio when she was 11. Ability to cook for 12 without breaking a sweat. Right. Shelter. Income. Something with her name attached to it in a way the law couldn't undo. She stared at the right column for a long time. Then she closed the ledger, blew out the lamp, and slept. Morning came hard and bright, the way Texas mornings did when they wanted to establish authority early. Hattie was at Morrison's Mercantile by 7, early enough that the smell of the previous day's tobacco hadn't fully aired out, and the shelves still held the arrangement they lost by noon. She needed 3 things: information about unclaimed land, a read on what kind of woman the town had decided she was before she'd done anything to earn the opinion, and coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute that passed for it in half the establishments west of Kansas City. She already knew the story would spread faster than she could get ahead of it. Abandoned mail-order bride, showed up to nothing. Man chose someone local instead. The town would have a version of her before the week was out, and that version would center on weakness and pity and cautionary tales, which was fine. Hattie had spent 31 years being underestimated and had learned to use it the way a card player used a bad poker face. Not to hide information, but to get people to volunteer it. She asked Mrs. Morrison about unclaimed parcels, abandoned homesteads, anything within walking distance that had lumber nobody was using. Mrs. Morrison was a careful woman, the kind who measured her words the way she measured flour, precisely and without waste. She told Hattie about the Holbrook place 3 miles east. A family taken by sickness 2 years back, 5 of them in one terrible week. The land was tied up in county paperwork that hadn't resolved, but the lumber was technically unclaimed. Nobody would argue with a woman who needed boards. That was when the voice came from the back of the store, a man at the far end of the counter, sitting on a stool with a glass in front of him that didn't have water in it. Not at 7 in the morning. He hadn't looked up when Hattie walked in, wasn't looking up now. Just staring at the middle distance with the unfocused gaze of a man who'd spent the night drinking and hadn't arrived at the decision to stop. Holbrook Place is 3 miles east. His voice was flat. Practiced in its flatness, the way voices got when they'd been keeping things level for a long time. Fence posts on the north side rot through. Fall on you before you see them coming. Hattie looked at him directly. He still didn't meet her eyes, late 40s. A face that had been weathered past its age. Hands wrapped around his glass the way hands gripped things when they were trying not to shake. Dressed like a working man but sitting like a man who'd recently stopped working and hadn't figured out what came next. Mrs. Morrison leaned across the counter, voice dropped to the register of things shared carefully. Vernon Shaw, former foreman out at the Grant Ranch. Let go about a month back, Silas Grant. The name landed in Hattie's mind and stayed, attached immediately to this man and this glass and this 7 in the morning drink. Whatever had ended between Vernon Shaw and Silas Grant had ended badly enough that Shaw was here instead of there, and badly enough that he'd kept drinking for a month straight. That was information worth filing. Hattie didn't look at Shaw again. She thanked Mrs. Morrison, bought a half-pound of Arbuckles, and walked out into the morning sun. She felt Shaw's eyes find her back as she crossed the threshold, through the window. Not the idle watching of a bored man, the watching of someone running calculations. The Holbrook place looked like a photograph of a house that had already decided to give up. 3 walls standing with the indifferent stubbornness of things that couldn't be bothered to fall down all the way. The roof had collapsed inward from the previous winter's snow weight, which meant the interior had been open to rain and sun for at least 1 full season. The wood that survived was the wood worth keeping. The bad pieces had already announced themselves as garbage, a useful kind of natural selection. You didn't have to guess which boards were good. The rot had made the decision. Hattie set her carpet bag against the largest remaining wall, propped the Winchester where she could reach it inside 2 seconds, and walked the full perimeter. She counted first. That was always the first step. Count what you actually have before you start wanting things you don't. 14 boards still lying flat and dry under the overhang of the east wall. Maybe 6 more under the collapsed porch roof, mostly intact. Several lengths of decent lumber half buried under the caved section that would need digging out. Enough, if she was careful. Enough, if she stopped using broken boards where straight ones were available. The problem was tools. She had a whalebone stay from her corset, which she'd already identified as the most useful prying instrument in her possession. She had strong hands and a working knowledge of basic framing from watching her father build their Ohio barn in 1868. More than 20 years ago, but geometry hadn't changed. What she didn't have was a hammer, a saw, or anything approximating a level. Work with what you have until you have better. Her mother's philosophy applied to everything from cooking to grief and most things in between. The whalebone stay bit into her palm on the second board. She shifted her grip and kept going. The nail came free with a sound like something giving up, and the board swung loose, and Hattie caught it before it hit the ground, blood on her palm. She looked at it the way a carpenter looked at a measurement, factually, without drama. Wrapped it with a strip torn from her petticoat, which her mother would have called a waste of good fabric and Hattie called field medicine, and kept going. The first corner of the frame went up wrong. She knew it halfway through. The angle was off by something she couldn't calculate without a level, but she could feel it. The way a wrong note sounded in an otherwise correct melody. She stopped, looked at it, took it apart, started again, second attempt, better, still not right. Third time, she stood back and tilted her head and looked from the distance. A mistake needed to become visible, and she found it. Not the angle, the foundation point. The post was set 2 inches north of where it needed to be. She dug it up and moved it. Fourth attempt was right. She didn't celebrate. She set the opposite corner. This was the thing about building. The satisfaction wasn't in finishing. It was in the specific, quiet pleasure of doing a thing correctly after doing it wrong. The failed attempts weren't wasted. They were the lesson. You couldn't skip them. You could only move through them faster if you paid close attention. The sun climbed. Her dress soaked through between her shoulder blades. Her hands found a rhythm. Pry and lift and check and set, and she stopped thinking about Thomas and stopped thinking about Holt Briggs and stopped thinking about her mother's china in someone else's cupboard, and she just built, which is exactly how she almost missed the horse. She'd caught it 10 minutes back, actually. A single rider approaching from the northwest at a walking pace. Walking meant no emergency, no aggression. Northwest meant Grant Ranch direction, based on what Mrs. Morrison had mentioned about the land arrangements out here. She'd registered it and kept working, letting her left hand settle fractionally closer to the Winchester without making a production of it. The horse stopped. The rider didn't speak immediately. A man with bad intentions announced himself quickly, through aggression or through the kind of false friendliness that was its own announcement. This one just looked at what she was doing with the focused attention of someone who knew what they were seeing. That crossbeam's going to fall on you, not a warning. A statement of structural fact, delivered with the tone a man used when he said the creek was running low or the sky was going to turn. She had heard that tone in her father's voice essing his barn, and in Thomas's voice looking at a column of numbers that didn't balance. The voice of someone who paid attention to things. Hattie didn't flinch. Let one full breath pass before she answered. Then I'll build another. The rider made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. No, ma'am. I don't reckon you will. Not if it comes down where you're standing. Now she looked up. 35, maybe. Hard to tell with a face that weather had worked into something older than it probably was. Tall enough that the horse looked proportioned under him rather than too small. Hands on the reins with the loose grip of someone who'd been riding since before he could read. The wagon behind him carried pine, not Hulbrook Gray's scrap, but fresh-cut straight stock that still smelled of the mill. He was looking at her crossbeam the way a craftsman looked at another person's mistake. Not with contempt. With the focused attention of someone who had already started solving the problem in his head. Show me, she said. He dismounted. Slow, deliberate, hands visible, moving with the care of someone who understood that a woman alone with a rifle deserved a clear read on his intentions. He walked to the corner she'd most recently set, crouched down, ran one work-scarred hand along the base of the post, and without saying anything demonstrated the angle differential with his palms. One flat, one tilted, showing how the weight would ride down wrong and push out instead of transferring downward. Hattie watched. Not the way a student watched a teacher, with deference built in, but the way one professional watched another demonstrate something. Looking for the underlying principle, not just the mechanics. She went to the opposite corner. Applied the same logic, set it differently. He watched her do it. Nodded, one nod, clean and without embellishment. Just acknowledgement. He pulled a hammer from the wagon bed and held it out. She took it. The weight settled into her palm differently than the whalebone stay, heavier and truer, balanced in a way her hand found without instruction. She drove the first nail in 2 strokes, flush and clean, Silas Grant, loading the introduction with nothing extra. No offered hand, no title, nothing requiring a specific response. Hattie Bowman. She positioned the next board, the Holbrook lumber. If this causes a problem, nobody's claimed it, nobody will. He was already measuring the next span with his arm spread. Waste of good wood, lying out here rotting. They worked. The sun moved. Neither of them talked much, which Hattie found immediately clarifying. She'd spent years in households where silence was a social failure requiring correction, where quiet was something to fill at all costs. Thomas had been different. Thomas could be in a room for 2 hours without saying anything, and you never felt the absence of words. She hadn't found that quality in anyone since. When she figured out what she was doing, Silas stopped explaining. When she had a better idea, the roof slope, she wanted it steeper for better rain runoff. She pointed instead of asking permission. He adjusted without comment or reassertion. No small demonstration of seniority. She had a better angle, so they used her angle. Full stop. That was the first thing she noticed about Silas Grant. The second came near the hour mark, when the work had settled into its rhythm and the silence between them had moved from polite to natural. He was trimming a board to length, focused down on the saw, and said it without appearing to decide to say it. My wife used to say a frame only stands if the corners trust each other. Hattie's hands kept moving. Used to? The saw kept moving too. For a few strokes. Fever. 4 years back, she heard what wasn't said more clearly than what was. The grammar of fever instead of the longer explanation, specific enough to be real, not expanded into a story he was trying to tell. 4 years back with no embellishment, which meant he had the number memorized, but wasn't in the habit of counting forward from it. I'm sorry, she said, because there was nothing else worth saying. She hadn't told me yet. He set the trimmed board with the others, kept working. About the baby. 3 months along, Doc said afterward. She was waiting, didn't want me to worry before she was sure. There it was. Not just grief, but the particular, irresolvable kind that belonged to someone who didn't know what they'd lost until after they'd lost it. He hadn't been able to mourn what he never knew was coming. And underneath that, she heard this too, was a man who had spent 4 years wondering whether he was the kind of person his wife had felt she could tell things to. Whether she'd been protecting him or doubting him, that question had no clean answer. He knew it. She probably wanted to be sure first so she could tell you clean, Hattie said. Without the maybe still in it. That's not doubt, that's care. He was quiet. Maybe, one word. But he didn't look away from the work, which meant he was considering it rather than dismissing it. They finished the frame as the sun bled orange across the bottom of the sky. When Silas loaded his remaining tools back into the wagon, he set half of them back down beside the structure. Good tools. Hammer, saw square, a tin of 10-penny nails. I don't take charity, Hattie said, not offering any. Just figure if you're going to build something, might as well build it right. He climbed to the wagon seat and gathered the reins. Ranch is 6 miles north. I'll be back tomorrow with more lumber. I'll be here before you are. Early as you want. The wagon rolled forward, wheels cutting fresh ruts through the buffalo grass. He didn't look back. Hattie stood and watched the wagon go until she couldn't hear the wheels. Then she sat with her back against the largest standing wall of the old Holbrook place and the Winchester across her knees and watched the stars come out over the Texas prairie. One by one, like they'd been waiting for the dark to make them visible, the frame stood behind her. Not finished, not weatherproof, but square and true and made correctly. That was something. She unwrapped her palm and examined the cut in the moonlight. Deep enough to scar. Her hands had always been working hands. Short nails, broad palms, the slight callus at the base of her right index finger from years of bookkeeping with a pen that ran rough. She'd never thought of them as pretty and had never particularly minded. Some things ought to leave marks. Remind you of the price of building something real. She rewrapped the palm, settled back against the wall, and started thinking about mourning. Silas Grant came back before she'd finished her coffee. She'd rationed herself to half a cup that morning. Arbuckles, the real kind, brewed over her small fire with the careful economy of a woman who understood that good coffee was one of the few reasonable pleasures available to a person sleeping under canvas. And she was halfway through it when she heard the wagon. Earlier than yesterday, loaded heavier, 2 wooden crates, a toolbox, and something wrapped in burlap that might be window frames. He climbed down carrying a basket covered in blue-checked cloth, set it on the flat rock she'd been using as a table, pulled back the cloth without ceremony, biscuits still warm enough to steam in the cool morning air, and a jar of sorghum molasses. Figured you hadn't eaten proper. He poured coffee from his own pot into 2 tin cups, strong enough that she could smell it from 4 feet away, which she appreciated in a coffee. Hattie took the cup. Let the heat soak through her bandaged palm. What's this about, Mr. Grant? Breakfast. He bit into a biscuit with the focused satisfaction of a man who'd made it himself and knew it was good. And business, she waited. Men who moved the way he did, deliberately, without wasted motion, didn't bring breakfast without a reason worth the biscuits. Lost my cook 2 years ago. He dipped his biscuit in his coffee, which was a habit she found endearing against her better judgment. Ruth Calloway. Worked for my father before me. Died in her sleep, natural as dying comes. Been making do since. Cowboys don't complain about food, but they don't stay long when the meals are bad and the books are worse. Show me the books. He reached into the wagon and pulled out a ledger, set it on the flat rock between them. She opened it. Chaos, not the chaos of someone hiding things. The chaos of someone attempting a job they hadn't been trained for and hadn't had time to learn properly. Numbers scratched out and written over. No consistent system across months. Some pages water-stained from being set near the pump, dates jumping backward and forward within the same column, but underneath the mess, the skeleton of a working ranch. A profitable one, if managed correctly. She turned back 2 pages, found the cattle purchase entries, ran the math in her head. Her finger stopped at a column near the bottom. She turned back 3 more pages, found November compared. You're losing money on every cattle sale. Factual, not accusatory. This was math, not character judgment. The middleman is taking 15% when the market rate is 8, maybe 10 at the outside. Suspected as much. Can't prove it without better records. Give me a week with these books. I'll show you exactly where every penny's going and where you're being taken advantage of. She closed the ledger, set it back on the rock. But I have conditions. Something in his expression shifted. Surprise, but a recalibration. He'd expected her to need the work badly enough to take any terms offered. He was reassessing. Good. She'd rather be underestimated and then clarified than be estimated correctly from the start. It was a more honest foundation. Sunday half-days are mine. Use of a horse when needed for town errands. No personal services beyond cooking and books. I'm not washing clothes or mending shirts. She met his eyes directly. And if any of your men get ideas about what a woman living alone on a ranch might be offering, you back me clear and public. Not privately, not later. In the moment, in front of witnesses, done. No hesitation, no pause to perform consideration. I haven't said yes. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more like recognition. No, but you're negotiating terms, which means you're thinking yes. She wanted to argue with that and found she couldn't, because it was accurate. He reached into his vest pocket and set a brass key on the rock between them. Heavy for its size, the brass worn smooth from handling. Quarters are ready now. Separate entrance, lock on the door from the inside. Ordered the lock from Dallas. Best they had. Bed, dresser, washstand, stove for winter heat. I want to see the kitchen first. Meet the men before I decide. Fair enough. He started loading tools into the wagon. $23 a month plus room and board. First month in advance, Hattie looked at the frame she'd built. The canvas still needing to go up for the roof. The corner she'd had to redo 3 times before the angle sat right. She looked at the tools Silas had left yesterday, still lined up in the neat row she'd arranged them in at the day's end. 25. 23 is fair. 25 accounts for the fact that you need this done more than I need to do it. I've had offers this week and turned them down. She hadn't, but she would have turned them down if they'd come, and the distinction felt technical rather than dishonest. 25 and you pay the first month today. He studied her for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to be offended or impressed, landing on impressed. 24. First month in advance. Done. She packed her few things into the carpet bag, the tools she'd borrowed from the Hulbrook place, the canvas rigged for temporary shelter. She worked efficiently, and when everything was packed, she stood and looked at the structure she'd built over 2 days. Not complete, not weatherproof, but solid, square, honest in its framing. Why did you really come back yesterday? She picked up the carpet bag with the lumber. Not the practical reason, the real one. He was at the wagon, checking the load. He didn't answer immediately. A jackrabbit burst from the grass near the cottonwood tree and bounded away in its erratic, panicked zigzag. And Silas watched it go with the unhurried attention of a man who had watched jackrabbits long enough to find them interesting. My mother was a mail-order bride, he said, still watching the spot where the rabbit had disappeared. From Indiana. The man who sent for her died of a snake bite 2 days before she arrived. She had $14 and a trunk full of books. He came around to the wagon side near her. My father found her trying to hire on at the hotel in town, offered her work instead. They married 4 years later. That's why you helped me? No. He turned and looked at her with a directness she found rare in men his age. The direct look that didn't need anything back from it, that wasn't asking for agreement or admiration. Helped you because you were doing it wrong, and I can't abide bad construction. A pause. The other thing was recognition. That's different. He climbed to the wagon seat and offered his hand down. She took it. One moment of his calloused palm against her bandaged one. The kind of contact that didn't mean anything except that a person offered and another accepted without making more of it than it was. The Grant Ranch grew ahead of them on the low rise, and Hattie looked at the straight line of Silas's jaw and the easy way he held the reins and thought about a woman in Indiana who had arrived to nothing and built something anyway, and thought about how the son of that woman had grown up knowing that was possible. The ranch appeared over a low rise, main house 2 stories, white paint worn to gray wood in places but the structure underneath sound and square. Barn of the kind that took a decade to build and another to stop being proud of. Bunkhouse, smokehouse, multiple outbuildings, every one of them set at right angles to everything else. Built to last rather than to impress. 3 cowboys by the corral, one more appearing from the barn at the sound of the wagon. All of them looking at her with the measuring assessment of men calculating what her presence meant for their daily routines and their comfort and their food. Caleb Voss came out last from the main house. The foreman, 40 years old, a square-jawed man from Kansas who had been with the Grant Ranch for 6 years. He ran the hands with the efficient authority of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove he was in charge. He looked at Hattie the way she'd looked at the frame she was building, taking in the whole structure before forming judgments about any individual part. Mrs. Bowman, he touched his hat. The men are glad to hear about the cooking. Hattie looked at the kitchen window. Even from the yard she could see the curtains inside were rotted, and the smoke pattern from the chimney was wrong for a properly drawing stove. She had 6 things to fix in that kitchen before she could cook a meal worth eating, and she was already ranking them by priority. She was about to ask Caleb to show her the way when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Fast. From the direction of town. The rider came through the gate without slowing. The gate was familiar to him, that much was clear. He pulled up hard 20 feet from the wagon, close enough that the horse's sudden stop threw dust across everyone's boots. The animal was sweating and unhappy about the pace it had been kept at, and the man on its back looked like he'd been drinking since before the horse was saddled. Vernon Shaw. Not the careful, calculating man from the back of Morrison's store. That version had been dangerous in a contained way, the danger in his stillness and his eyes. This version had let the containment go. His face was flushed with something between drink and fury, and his eyes had the bright, unfocused quality of a man who had been feeding himself a particular story long enough that it had started to feel like history. His gaze found Hattie immediately. Then stayed. Heard you picked up Holt Briggs's leftovers. The words had blurred edges, the consonants not landing cleanly, but the meaning was precise. The cruelty of it was precise. The temperature in the yard dropped 10 degrees. She felt the men go still around her. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of people waiting to take their signal from Silas, who had come down from the wagon without her noticing and was standing 4 feet to her left. Hattie stepped forward before the signal could be given, not because she didn't trust Silas to handle it, because she had learned in 31 years that there were moments when stepping back and letting someone handle it for you cost more than the moment was worth. Because Vernon Shaw was looking at her like she was a problem someone else had made, and she needed him to understand she was a problem she had made herself. Mr. Shaw, her voice came out even, which pleased her. I've seen your bookkeeping. The flush in Shaw's face shifted. Something underneath the drink focused hard. What? November's cattle count was off by 11 head. The feed purchase in October cost 40% more than September with the same herd size. She watched his face go through white, then red, the red angrier than the white. I know enough to know where to look for the rest. You don't know nothing. He stopped, recalculated. The hot anger settled into something colder, which was more dangerous. Watch yourself, woman. Accidents happen on ranches, men get thrown. Fences break in bad places, Virgil. Silas's voice came flat and cold. You're drunk and you're done here. Get out. Shaw's eyes moved to Silas, then back to Hattie. The look he gave her was the look of a man filing something away, not for right now, but for later, when the odds were different and the audience wasn't there. This ain't over, Weston. He wheeled his horse, barely stayed on it, spurred it too hard through the gate. The yard held its quiet until the sound faded. Then Danny Ward, the youngest hand, barely 19, face still undecided about what it would look like at 40, said carefully, "He's going to come back, isn't he?" Caleb Voss said nothing, but the look he gave Hattie confirmed the answer. Silas, already walking toward the main house. Kitchen, Mrs. Bowman. She followed him across the yard and didn't look back at the gate, because looking back was for people who hadn't already decided to stay. The kitchen door stood open. Inside, a pot of beans had carbonized on the stove. Not burnt but carbonized, which was a different thing and required different cleaning. The stove itself was good cast iron, heavy and capable, but the flue needed adjustment and the firebox had accumulated ash from infrequent cleaning. The counter had been wiped recently but not properly. The floor had been swept but not scrubbed. Good bones. Bad maintenance. Two different problems with two different solutions. She turned to face the men crowded in the doorway. All 8 of them, Silas among them. Dinner is at 6 sharp. She turned back to the stove and started the assessment. Any man who arrives late goes hungry. This kitchen is mine unless I invite you in. Questions, silence. The good kind. What's for dinner? Danny Ward. Unable to help himself, beef stew if I can salvage these beans. Biscuits if the oven draws proper. Preserved peaches if I find any. She opened the pantry door, scanned the shelves in 3 seconds. Ruth Calloway's handwriting on every label, neat, careful, dated. 2 years old but properly sealed. Still good. Coffee that doesn't taste like regret. Anything else? Danny grinned so wide it looked like it might hurt. The other men relaxed by degrees, which among working cowboys was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Out of my kitchen, Hattie said. All of you. Work to do, they scattered. All but Silas, who lingered at the door. The books, he said. If Shaw's been stealing, I need proof that holds. Not just the arithmetic, give me 3 days. He threatened you. He threatened the idea of me. She was already clearing the carbonized pot, handling it with the respect owed to a thing destroyed in the line of duty. He hasn't met the actual version yet. That'll take more than one visit to adjust to. Silas reached past her and opened a cabinet near the door. The shotgun standing inside was loaded. She could tell by the way he handled it, confirming rather than checking. You know how to use one? My father taught me to shoot before he taught me to read. He had clear ideas about the order of necessary skills. Good. He stepped back and left without another word. Hattie stood alone in her kitchen for the first time. She opened both windows, let the smoke out and the evening air in, started the water pump, filled the sink, began the triage of what could be salvaged and in what order. Through the window above the pump she could see the yard, the barn, the bunkhouse. The men going about afternoon work with the renewed focus of people who had been slightly embarrassed and were compensating through industry. By 4 o'clock the kitchen smelled right. Beef browning, onions softening in the rendered fat, beans going from rigid to tender in salted water. The biscuit dough came together under her hands with the muscle memory of 1,000 previous batches. She found Ruth Calloway's notes tucked behind the flour canisters. Oven runs hot on the left side. Danny needs extra portions. He hasn't finished growing. Who takes their coffee black? Who would quietly eat around the beans if they thought nobody was watching? Ruth Calloway had paid attention. You could see it in every note. Hattie read through the pages carefully, then folded them and put them in her apron pocket. Some things were worth inheriting. At 5:30 she set the table in the main room. 8 places. She polished each piece of tarnished silver with her apron and set them at exact right angles. When Silas came in and stopped short at the formal table setting, she said, without turning from the kitchen, "Men work hard. They should eat like it matters." She heard him stand there in the silence that meant someone was being changed by a small thing and knowing it. At 6 o'clock exactly, 8 men filed in cleaner than they'd been all day. Hair slicked back with water, hands scrubbed pink. Danny had changed his shirt. They stood behind chairs with the uncertain posture of men in an unfamiliar situation waiting. "Sit," Hattie said. They sat. She brought the stew pot, ladled generous portions, set the biscuits center table. Preserved peaches at the far end, still good from Ruth's careful sealing. Poured coffee black and strong, nobody moved. "Eat," she said. Caleb Voss took the first bite. His eyes closed for half a second. Then Danny Ward reached for a biscuit and everything broke open. Hands and spoons and the comfortable sound of hungry people eating food worth eating. "These biscuits," James Fowler said. He was the quiet one, the man who had been here longest after Caleb, who chose his words like a man who kept a careful inventory. He searched for what he was trying to say, like Ruth used to make, Silas said. Soft. "First words at the table better," Fowler said, then looked stricken. "No disrespect to Ruth." "None taken," Hattie said. She left good notes. I followed them. After the meal, after the men had filed out with their quiet thank yous, and Danny Ward had tried to stay and help clear and been firmly redirected, Silas lingered in the doorway. "The books," he said. "You started looking." She dried her hands on her apron. "Someone's been stealing from you, Mr. Grant. Small amounts, steady drain. About $40 a month for at least 6 months. Sure, most likely. The pattern fits his departure." But it didn't start with his departure. She moved to the counter where she'd left the ledger. "These entries here. Different hand, different pattern entirely. Someone else started taking money about 2 months ago." His jaw tightened. "Who?" "Can't tell yet. 3 days, access to the store records in town and the bank, and I'll have a name." She looked at him steadily. "Numbers don't lie, Mr. Grant. People do. But the numbers record exactly what the people were doing." He stared at the ledger. Where his hand gripped the counter edge, his knuckles had gone white. "I trusted Shaw. 8 years he worked here. Trust and verification aren't enemies." She closed the ledger. "They're how you make trust mean something real." He looked at her then. The direct look that took things seriously, without hurry. "You planning to verify me too?" Already started, something shifted in his expression. Something that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. "Find who's stealing. Then we deal with it properly." He left her alone in the kitchen. Hattie washed the dishes and thought about Vernon Shaw's face when she'd mentioned the November count. The specific quality of a man correctly identified rather than wrongly accused. She thought about the second set of entries in the books, the copied handwriting that wasn't quite right, through the window, movement near the smokehouse. Caleb Voss stepped into the lamplight, a smaller ledger in his hand. He saw her watching, raised his free hand, palm out, slow and clear. She went to the back door. He showed her his own parallel records kept in a notebook in his vest pocket. Every head of cattle tracked separately from the ranch books. Every supply delivery noted. Every discrepancy between what the book said and what he'd counted himself. "When things go missing," Caleb said, "they look first at the foreman. I've been a foreman before. I know how that goes. No appeal for sympathy. Just the operational reality of his situation stated plainly. If I have records showing I knew about the discrepancies before you arrived and didn't benefit from them, that's worth keeping." His numbers matched hers up until 6 weeks ago. Then the discrepancy started. "You see it, she see it. Don't know who, I believe you." He held her gaze for a moment, measuring the statement for honesty rather than courtesy. Apparently found what he was looking for. "Keep tracking. Compare with mine in 3 days. I'll know the who by then," he nodded. Once, acknowledgement without elaboration, and disappeared back toward the bunkhouse. Hattie stood in the warm dark for a moment, looking at the flat horizon where the stars met the prairie grass. And there it was. A single horse on the ridge, barely visible. A rider sitting motionless, watching the lights of the ranch house with the patient attention of someone who had decided to wait rather than act. Vernon Shaw. Still calculating, she went back inside, checked the shotgun behind the front door, checked the lock on her quarters, and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the lamp burning low. She turned to the second anomalous set of entries and started working backward from the most recent toward the first. The second thief was in there, written in their own careful disguise. She'd have a name by morning. Saturday came in grey and close, the sky the color of old pewter, the air already thick with humidity that promised rain by afternoon and delivered something worse by evening. Hattie was at the kitchen stove by 5:30, not because she hadn't slept. She had 3 solid hours between 2 and 5, which was sufficient, but because the books had given her a name the night before, and she needed to walk into Morrison's Mercantile with the right expression on her face. Not accusatory, not triumphant, the expression of a woman conducting ordinary business. The kind that made people volunteer information they hadn't planned to share, the blue dress. The one she'd worn on the platform at Caldwell Station, which she'd washed and pressed and hung on the back of her door 2 days ago. It was the only dress she owned that communicated professional, conducting professional business, rather than woman who works with her hands. And both things were true, but you wore the message that served the moment. She pinned her hair, examined the result in the small mirror above the washstand. A woman of 31 with a fresh-healed cut across her right palm and eyes that had been described as intelligent by people who meant it as a compliment and as unsettling by people who didn't. The particular set to her jaw that her mother had called stubborn and her father had called useful, fine. She also, before leaving the kitchen, wrote a brief letter on the back of a clean ledger page, folded it, and addressed it to the Fort Worth Livestock Exchange. She'd identified the cattle sale anomaly 4 days ago. 15 head recorded as dead from disease in November, but with no corresponding bone count in Ruth Calloway's meticulous smokehouse records. Dead cattle left bones. Bones got counted and rendered or burned. Ruth had noted every single one for the past 3 years of her records. 15 head with no accounting. Someone had sold those cattle alive to a buyer from Fort Worth and recorded them as dead. The letter requested confirmation of any transfer of cattle bearing the Grant Ranch brand in the past 6 months, the name of the purchasing party, and copies of any same transfer documents on file. She sealed it and put it in her apron pocket to post from Morrison's. She'd been planning for the possibility of shore since day 3. That was the difference between preparing and expecting. You built the case before you needed it, so that when you needed it, it was already built. Silas was at the corral when she came out, checking the harness on the buckboard with the systematic attention he brought to everything mechanical. He looked up when he heard her step on the porch. Sure you don't want company? Not quite a question. Town people talk more freely to women alone. She took the reins without asking, especially about men's business. Shaw's usually at Murphy's by noon on Saturdays. He was still holding one end of the harness. Not blocking, just present. Drunk enough to be honest by 10, I know. She settled on the seat, checked the sky to the west, still grey, not yet threatening. I'll be back by 3, if you're not, I will be. She clucked to the horse and rolled out before the sentence could finish itself into something that required a response. The road to Caldwell cut straight through the grass, the ruts deep from years of wagon traffic. She kept the horse at a steady trot and let her mind run ahead to Morrison's, to the bank, to the arrangement of evidence in the order she'd need it. 3 things to confirm: the store records, the tobacco, the whiskey, the ammunition charged to the Grant account and signed for by Shaw after his termination date. The bank records, 3 deposits entered in the ranch books but never actually made, and the signature comparison, which was the piece she needed most, because the second thief was hiding behind Shaw's methods and she needed to prove the handwriting wasn't his before she could establish whose it was. The wrong approach was direct accusation. Accusations without witnesses dissolved into competing claims, and in a town this size, with a woman newcomer making the charge, she knew whose account would be believed first. What she needed was documentation, public documentation, witnessed by people with sufficient social standing that denial would become structurally impossible. Mrs. Alcott would be at Morrison's. Saturday morning fabric counter. She could have predicted that without being told. And Mrs. Alcott, for all her sharp edges and sharper tongue, was one of the most reliable information channels in Caldwell, which meant that anything witnessed today would be common knowledge by supper. A liability in most situations, a resource in this one. The cemetery came first on the road into town, the way it always did in settlements of this era. Wooden crosses and occasional stone markers, the dead placed at the approach rather than the departure, a habit of frontier planning she'd never fully understood. Then the church with its paint peeling in long strips. Then the scatter of buildings accumulating into Main Street. Busier on Saturday than any other day, with ranch families in for supplies and children running loose between storefronts. She tied the buckboard outside Morrison's and went in, the bell above the door. 5 women at the fabric counter arranged around Mrs. Alcott, the way planets arrange themselves around the largest gravitational body in a system. All 5 turning at the sound of the bell. All 5 performing the particular feminine calculation of appraising a new arrival. Dress, hair, hands, the purpose in her walk. Hattie went directly to the main counter. "Mr. Morrison, I need to review the Grant Ranch account records." Morrison was a thick-bodied man with nervous eyes that moved constantly between his customers and whatever he was afraid might upset them. He glanced at Mrs. Alcott the way people checked a weather vane for direction. "That's Mr. Grant's private business, which he's asked me to manage." Hattie kept her voice carrying, not loud, just pitched to reach all 5 women at the fabric counter without effort. "Unless there's a problem with his credit I should know about." No problem at all." Morrison pulled a ledger from under the counter and set it down heavily. She opened it, ran her finger down the columns with the focused efficiency of someone who read numbers the way other people read sentences, fast, taking in meaning rather than individual symbols. There are 3 entries in the past 6 weeks: tobacco, whiskey, and a box of 44 cartridges, all signed to the Grant account. She turned back to the date of Shaw's termination, confirmed it, turned forward again. Shaw had been signing for goods 2 weeks after Silas had let him go, using his former position like a key that should have stopped working the day he left the property. She memorized the dates, the amounts, the pattern. Closed the ledger. Interesting reading. Mrs. Alcott had moved closer, her group drifting behind her like fabric pulled on a thread. Her voice was warm the way water was warm just before it started to boil. "Must be quite educational, working so closely with Mr. Grant." Hattie turned one more page, confirmed one more entry. Educational. Then she looked up and met Mrs. Alcott's eyes without flinching. "The accounting work specifically. All alone out there." Mrs. Alcott's smile didn't fully commit to the face below it. "Just the 2 of you, 8 ranch hands, Mr. Voss as foreman, and a lock on my door from the inside." Hattie's voice stayed pleasant. "Hardly alone, Mrs. Alcott. Still, people will. People always talk when they have nothing more pressing to occupy their time. Not unkind, just accurate." She turned back to Morrison. "I need copies of these 3 entries." She also passed him the sealed letter for Fort Worth across the counter. "And I need this posted today, please." Before Morrison could respond, the door opened. Silas, hat in hand, filling the doorway with his presence in the way tall men did in low-ceilinged buildings. He'd said he wasn't coming. He was here anyway. She'd process that later. "Ladies," he nodded to the group, then found Hattie's eyes. "Found what you needed?" "Most of it." She turned back to Morrison. "Those copies. Right away, Mr. Grant." Morrison was already reaching for pen and paper. Silas came to stand beside her. Not touching, not close enough for anyone to read impropriety into the proximity, but present. The kind of standing beside that carried meaning without requiring words. These tobacco purchases. Silas had the ledger now, his jaw doing the thing it did when he was working to keep his voice level. "Who picked them up?" Morrison's fingers fumbled the pages. "I'd have to. Here, those were picked up by Vernon Shaw. Signed right here 2 weeks after." He stopped, looked at the date, looked at Silas, understood what he was looking at. "He said you'd approved continued charges while his severance was being settled. I paid his severance the day I let him go. Full amount in cash." Silas closed the ledger with controlled force. "From today, nothing charges to my account without Mrs. Bowman's written approval. Is that clear?" "Very clear, Mr. Grant." Mrs. Alcott made a sound. The sound of a woman with an opinion she'd decided to share regardless of whether it was wanted. How modern. A woman managing money matters. A competent person managing money matters. Silas didn't look at her. The woman part just happens to be true. Hattie turned toward the door before Mrs. Alcott could reload bank records. Deposit slips last 6 months. The bank was 3 buildings down. Mr. Alcott ran it. A thin man who looked like he'd been wrung out repeatedly and hadn't fully recovered his original shape. He had papers ready when they walked in, which told her that 60 seconds between Morrison's and here had been enough time for a message to travel. Information moved fast in small towns. She'd counted on it. The 3 deposits from last month, Hattie said before pleasantries could establish themselves. She set her notebook open on the counter, entries cross-referenced and dated. Do you have the slips? Alcott checked again more slowly. No record of them, never made. That's $90 total in 1 month. Math, not drama. Who had authorization to make deposits on the Grant account? Mr. Grant, of course. Alcott chose his words carefully, the way a man walked a path he wasn't sure was solid all the way across. Mr. Shaw when he was foreman. And, he stopped and? 2 months ago there was a request to add a second authorized name. The request came through Mr. Voss. Alcott opened another ledger. Said Mr. Grant had approved it. Silas went still beside her, not the working still. The other kind, the name? Hattie asked. Earl Pruitt, she wrote it down. Kept writing, kept her face neutral. Kept the pen moving across the page so that whatever was happening in her chest, the small cold recognition of a name she'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm, didn't reach her expression. The missing deposits, she said. The dates they should have been made. Where was Earl Pruitt on those days? Alcott looked at the calendar. The 8th, the 11th, and the 19th. Hattie opened to her own records, the ones she'd been building since her first night with the ranch books. On the 8th and 11th, Earl was working the north fence line. I cross-checked with Mr. Voss's work log, which I reviewed Thursday morning while organizing the labor schedule. Silas turned to look at her. He couldn't have been in 2 places. She gave Alcott the dates. 40 miles from here, both days. I have the work log entries. Alcott studied the calendar with the expression of a man who had not wanted to reach the conclusion he was reaching. You're right. He couldn't have. Then the authorization was used by someone else, in Earl's name. She closed her notebook. I'll need copies of all deposit slips from the past 6 months. The ones made and the recorded dates of the ones that weren't. Outside, Silas walked beside her toward Morrison's without speaking for half a block. The street was busy around them. Normal Saturday foot traffic, children, a dog with opinions about the wagon blocking the dry goods store. A morning that had no idea what was being assembled inside the numbers she carried. You knew, not accusation. Something quieter, I suspected from the books. Confirmed it this morning. She stopped at Morrison's to collect her fabric. Kitchen curtains, a practical errand she'd stacked onto the investigative one because efficiency was a habit she couldn't turn off. Earl Pruitt is not your thief. He's the name someone borrowed, someone with access to the authorization paperwork and knowledge of which hands were where on which days, which narrows it considerably. To 3 people with full access, she kept her voice low. You, Voss, and whoever had unsupervised time in the main house office. Silas stopped walking. She kept going, because some realizations needed privacy, and she'd given him the information and now he needed to work through it without her watching his face. He caught up at Morrison's door. The work logs, he said. His voice had gone very quiet. I keep a copy in the office. Second drawer, unlocked during the day, which meant anyone who came in to report. Anyone who waited in the office. Anyone who helped themselves to the second drawer for 30 unobserved seconds. Any of them could have had access. She went into Morrison's, selected blue and white calico for kitchen curtains. The rotted ones she'd noted on day 1 were now a legitimate business expense, and enough for her own window if the remnant allowed. She was at the counter waiting for Morrison to measure and cut when the door opened behind her. Not the bell, she heard the step. The hesitation of a foot that had crossed this threshold many times and was uncertain today about its welcome. Dora Briggs. Younger than Hattie had expected, maybe 25. The kind of pretty that had started wearing at the edges from some interior weather, using her up faster than years alone could account for. She twisted her wedding ring as she approached. The ring was thin brass showing through worn gold plate, the kind of ring that told its own story about the promises attached to it. Mrs. Bowman, her voice was careful, soft. I wanted to say what he did, writing to you, making those promises. She stopped, started again. I told him to write and explain properly. Before you came all this way, he said another stop. He said let her figure it out herself. And I did. Hattie kept her voice level. Not warm, not cold, I just wanted you to know. Dora's eyes went briefly to Hattie's left hand, to the absence of a ring, to whatever story she was constructing about what that meant. You're better off with Mr. Grant. He's a good man. People respect him. I work for Mr. Grant. Nothing more, of course. I didn't mean, already backing away, already trying to unmake the implication. I should go. Holt is waiting, through the window. Holt Briggs was leaning against a post outside Murphy's saloon with the posture of a man whose primary relationship was with the building behind him. His cuffs were frayed. His boots had worn unevenly at the heel in the way that happened when a man didn't replace things until they failed completely. Whatever Holt had chosen instead of Hattie, it had not delivered what was promised. She felt nothing about this. No satisfaction, no pity. It was simply a data point about the consequences of poor planning, and she had her own planning to focus on. Morrison finished cutting. She signed for the fabric, added it to the grant account with the careful signature she'd established as the account's authorized manager, and went out to where Silas was waiting at the buckboard. "One more stop," she said. "I need to compare signatures." Back into Morrison's, the ledger out again. Shaw's signature on the 3 fraudulent entries. Then her notebook opened to the page where she'd carefully traced the signature from the ranch books, the one she'd identified as copied rather than original. She set them side by side. Shaw's signature was practiced, economical. The capital G in Grant had a specific rightward lean, the kind of idiosyncrasy that developed in a hand that had been signing the same name for 30 years. Sure of itself, efficient. The copied version was trying to be sure, and almost succeeding. Except look at the capital G in Grant. She held the notebook so Silas could see both. Shaw curves right at the top. This one curves left, hesitates at the turn. Her finger traced both paths. Someone copying from memory, not from practice. They've seen Shaw's signature, but they've never tried to reproduce it before these entries. Silas studied both versions. His face was doing the arithmetic of people rather than numbers, which was harder and less reliable. "Earl Pruitt," he said, and it wasn't a question. "No," she looked at him directly. "I told you, Earl couldn't have been in 2 places. The name is Earl's. The hand isn't. Someone borrowed his name and forged the authorization." He looked at her. "Then who?" Not Shaw. His own fraudulent entries looked nothing like these, and his methods were different entirely. Not Voss. His parallel ledger rules him out, and a man protecting himself that carefully wouldn't collaborate with someone else's scheme. She walked to the buckboard. Someone who had reason to use Earl's name specifically. Someone who knew Earl had a vulnerability that made his name useful as a shield. His daughter. She looked at him. Earl's daughter, Emma. Silas climbed to his side of the seat, gathered the reins with the steady hands that did everything deliberately. "She's been sick 2 years. Caleb told me 6 months ago she needed specialized care he couldn't afford on his wages. He was quiet for a block. I knew and I didn't act on it. I should have done something then. That's not an excuse for what's happening. No, but it's context." The reins shifted in his hands. "Don't confront anyone before you're certain. I'm already certain. I need one more piece of evidence, the kind that's witnessed. Then I won't confront anyone. A beat. We won't." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road ahead. But we had been deliberate. She was sure of it. The ride back from town was quieter than the ride in. Not an uncomfortable quiet, the settled kind, the kind that happened when 2 people had done a hard thing together and were letting it rest between them without needing to narrate it. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Silas spoke. "My wife," he kept his eyes on the horses. "I've been thinking about what you said, that she was probably waiting to tell me until she was sure, so she could tell me clean." The reins moved through his hands, making the small adjustments that experienced drivers made without thinking. "I've been angry at myself for 6 years. For not making her feel like she could tell me the maybe before it became the certain." Hattie watched the grass moving in the rising wind. Ahead, the sky to the southwest had taken on the yellow-green tinge that experienced prairie people recognized before they could articulate why it unsettled them. "You said that to make me feel better," he continued. "But I've been turning it over and I think you also said it because you believed it. Those are different things. They're not mutually exclusive." "No," a long pause. "No, they're not." He glanced at her sideways. "So which was it?" "Both," she said, in equal measure. "I said it because it was true and because it might help. I don't separate the two if I don't have to." He absorbed this. She was careful with everything she valued, he said after a moment. She didn't spend money until she'd thought it through. Didn't plant seeds until the frost risk had passed. Didn't. He stopped. She wasn't a woman who acted on maybes. Then she was waiting for the certain so she could give it to you whole. Not protecting herself from your reaction. Giving you the best possible version of the news. Hattie watched the sky to the southwest. That's not the action of a woman who doubted you. He was quiet for a long time. The wagon wheels found a rut and corrected. A meadowlark called from the grass and got no answer. Thank you, he said. 2 words without ornament. The kind of thank you that meant something had actually been received rather than the reflexive kind that was just acknowledgement. She nodded once and looked back at the weather. That sky to the southwest. Getting worse. The evening after their return was occupied with dinner, with the men's quiet satisfaction over beef and cornbread, with Danny Ward managing to knock over his coffee cup and catch it before it hit the table in a motion that earned him genuine respect from James Fowler for the first time. Ordinary things. The kind of ordinary that a household accumulated when it was becoming a household rather than just a collection of people in the same building. After the men dispersed, Hattie sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under the lamp. She was cross-referencing the authorization dates against the worklog dates, building the final column of proof, when movement outside the window caught her attention. Caleb Voss, at the door of the smokehouse. Not checking supplies, he'd checked supplies that morning. He was standing in a particular way, the still posture of a man who was waiting for something he didn't know was coming yet. She went to the back door. He saw her before she spoke, showed her his own parallel ledger without preamble. His numbers, her numbers, the discrepancies started 6 weeks ago and grew by irregular amounts on irregular dates. You see the pattern in the timing, she said. Deposits made when the main house was empty. Caleb had been thinking about this. She could tell he had the careful precision of a man who had been constructing an argument before presenting it. Grant checks the south pasture on Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually gone 4 hours minimum. She looked at the dates, Tuesday the 8th. Thursday the 11th, not the 19th, that was a Saturday. She looked at the Saturday entry more carefully. Different amount, different method. The Saturday one wasn't a deposit, it was a direct cash withdrawal from the petty fund in the office desk. The one Silas kept for small ranch expenses. Someone had been learning. They'd started by forging deposits under Earl's authorization. When that became riskier, when Hattie arrived and started asking questions, they'd shifted to smaller, simpler thefts from the petty fund. Adapting, still taking, still believing the amounts were small enough to go unnoticed. She looked at Caleb, who has regular access to the main house Tuesdays and Thursdays. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, then looked at the smokehouse behind him, then back at her. Not answering directly, answering indirectly, the way honest men sometimes did when the answer was going to hurt someone they respected. I'll confirm it by morning, she said. Don't do anything before I do. I won't. He paused. He's a good hand otherwise. Best with horses we've had in 3 years. I know. She'd watched Earl Pruitt with the horses since day one. Patient, quiet, instinctively correct in the way some people were with animals. It was the same quality that had made him useful enough to trust with small responsibilities. And the same quality that made what he was doing feel like the particular tragedy of a good man making a sustained wrong choice. She went back inside. Checked the barometer on the wall. Ruth Calloway's notation on the frame read, "Drops fast, bad one coming." In the handwriting of a woman who'd stopped being surprised by Texas weather sometime in the previous decade, the needle was dropping fast. She looked out the window at the southern horizon. The rider was back on the ridge. Same horse, same stillness. Vernon Shaw had been out there 3 nights running now, watching the lights go out one by one in the main house, waiting with the patience of a grievance that hadn't found its moment yet. She pulled the curtain and went to bed. Sunday came with a sky that had made up its mind. The barometer at 6 in the morning had dropped below Ruth's lowest recorded mark. The air tasted like copper and ozone, and the grass was moving in the wrong direction, south to north, which meant the system was pulling from behind as well as pushing from the front. Hattie was in the garden by 6:15. The tomatoes were 2 weeks from proper harvest. She'd spent 3 weeks bringing them from the spindly starts she'd found struggling in Ruth's abandoned beds, adjusting the drainage around their roots when the July rains ran sideways, staking them against the south wind that came up every Tuesday afternoon like clockwork. They were producing well. The deep red was starting at the shoulders of the largest fruit, the sign of a plant that had been consistently watered and not stressed by insects or irregular heat. She was not interested in losing them to a storm she'd seen coming since noon yesterday, Mr. Voss. She found Caleb near the barn. already reading the sky with the experience of a man who had been through enough of these to know the difference between a line storm and a system. Storm coming. I need help securing the garden. He looked at the southwest horizon, did the calculation. I'll send Danny and I need you and Danny and whoever else you can spare. Within the hour, he sent 3 men. Silas came himself. They were in the garden when the first serious wind arrived. Not the testing gusts that had been running since before dawn, but the real wind, purposeful and low, moving fast across the prairie and taking everything in its path as a personal challenge. Hattie's dress plastered against her legs. Her hair escaped its pins in 2 places. She kept working. The glass clutches for the tomato plants. Ruth had left 6 in the shed, not enough for all the plants, but enough for the strongest ones. Hattie made the triage decisions fast. This plant, not that one. This row yes, this row no. Prioritizing the ones with the most fruit already set. She settled the clutches and weighted them with stones, working with the brisk economy of someone who had already done the math and knew exactly how much time she had. The bean poles won't hold. Silas was 3 rows over, already reading what she was reading. The poles had been set for normal summer wind, not this I know. She looked at Danny, who was already moving toward her before she spoke. Get the sledge from the tool shed. She held the poles upright while Silas drove the stakes deeper, Danny wrapping twine around each cluster of vines in a pattern she demonstrated once, and he grasped without needing to see it again. Rain started. Not a warning drizzle, rain. Immediate and decisive, soaking through Hattie's dress in the first 30 seconds, running cold down her neck, turning the garden paths to mud that pulled at her boots with each step. Lightning. Close enough that the air smelled like something burning that hadn't quite caught yet. Thunder followed before she'd finished counting. The biggest glass cloche. The one covering the plant with the most fruit, the one she'd spent an extra hour staking and draining 3 weeks ago, lifted off its moorings despite the stones, caught the wind sideways, sailed 3 feet before hitting the fence post and shattering into a dozen pieces. The tomato plant beneath it bent nearly flat in the gust. She dropped to her knees in the mud before she'd made a conscious decision. Both hands into the wet soil, packing earth around the plant's base, building the mound higher and denser, giving the stem something to lean against while it decided whether to give up or find the vertical again. The broken glass was everywhere in the mud. She felt it before she saw it, small cuts opening across both palms, precise and immediate under the dull ache of the nearly healed older wound. Rain washed the blood away as fast as it came. She kept packing, kept pressing the earth firm, kept building the mound higher. Hattie. Silas's voice had a different register than his work voice, sharper, with the edge of someone who had overridden their usual restraint. The plant isn't worth. I know what it's worth. She pressed more earth, shaped it firm against the stem. The plant was straightening, slowly, reluctantly, the stem deciding whether to commit to the vertical or surrender to the horizontal. I know exactly what it's worth, and I know what it cost to grow it, and I'm not leaving it to the wind. Strong hands under her arms, lifting. She let him, because the mound was built and the plant was upright, and there was nothing more she could do for it, and standing in a lightning storm. She'd done what she could do. That was the limit of what any of it asked. They got inside together. The door slammed behind them with the authority of weather that had opinions about open doors, hard enough to rattle the dishes on the kitchen shelves. Water ran off Hattie in sheets. Both paws were bleeding, not dramatically, but steadily, a dozen small cuts making themselves known now that the adrenaline of the garden was easing. She grabbed a kitchen towel and pressed it between her hands. The door opened again. Danny, then 2 more hands, then Caleb Voss. All of them soaked, all of them moving into the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of people who knew what storm routine looked like and had done it enough times not to require instruction. Caleb did the head count. Earl's securing the barn doors. Said he wouldn't leave the horses, which was true. Earl Pruitt would not leave horses in a storm. It was one of the things about him that was unimpeachable. And it was also, she noted without acting on the thought yet, convenient. Sit, she said to the room. Danny cups Caleb, top cupboard, Ruth stores. She was already at the stove with her towel-wrapped hands. Mr. Grant, sit down please, your hands. After the coffee is started, before, he was already pulling a chair close to hers. Already had her hand before she'd fully processed that he'd moved, holding it the way he held things that required both attention and care, the way he'd held the reins in the rain, the way he'd handled the window frame measurements on the first day. The sewing needle from the basket Danny produced, water from the clean pitcher, lamplight that the other men at the table politely pretended to be looking away from. He worked in silence. Each piece of glass found and removed with methodical care, the needle precise under the lamplight. Water poured over the cuts. Not gently, not roughly, thoroughly. She watched his face while he worked. The concentration lines around his eyes deepened when the needle required particular delicacy. He held his breath slightly while working the needle, released it when the glass came free. Why risk it? His voice was low enough for just the two of them, under the noise of cards and rain, and the other men finding their storm routine equilibrium at the table. Really, the real answer was about 3 weeks of work and the specific satisfaction of watching something grow when you'd given it what it needed. About the way growing things kept time differently than ledgers did. A tomato plant didn't know about 7 words on a piece of paper, or the Illinois inheritance laws, or Holt Briggs outside Murphy's saloon. It just grew if you let it. If you protected it when the weather turned wrong, because once something starts producing, you protect it, she said. Otherwise, what was the point of planting in the first place? His hands went still on hers, not stopping, pausing. The needle in his fingers, both her hands in both of his, and the lamplight between them, and the storm doing what storms did against the windows. He looked up. She was already looking at him. The moment didn't have a name. It didn't need one. It was the space before decisions, the space where two people recognized something simultaneously and had to choose what to do with the recognition. Neither of them moved, neither looked away. The door crashed open. Earl Pruitt, shoved in by the wind, fighting the door closed behind him with both hands. His shirt was torn at the shoulder where something had caught him. A swinging door, most likely, or a beam in the chaos of the barn. He turned into the kitchen and his eyes found Hattie before they found anything else. The way eyes found the thing they were afraid of. Barns secure, he was catching his breath. Horses are, he stopped. Looked at Hattie's hands in Silas's. Looked at the ledger she'd left open on the far counter, the one she'd been cross-referencing before the storm. Looked at her face. She kept her expression still. The bookkeeper's face. The one she'd worn across tables from people doing their accounts, when the columns were saying things the people didn't know she could read. Earl's shoulders dropped by half an inch, just half an inch. The kind of shift you noticed only if you were watching for it. Then the window gave way. The cracked pane she'd added to the maintenance list on day 2 finally lost its argument with the storm. The glass burst inward in a spray of fragments and rain and Texas summer air that had somehow gone cold. Everyone moved at once, Caleb grabbing the tablecloth, Danny pushing the table clear, Silas stepping between Hattie and the window in a motion she suspected was purely reflexive. Something installed deeper than any considered decision. They got the tablecloth nailed into place. The wind fought it for 10 minutes, then accepted the arrangement. The kitchen settled into the uneasy truce of a space that had been invaded and defended, and was now holding its ground. Hattie rewrapped her hands with cloth torn from the spare petticoat she'd been keeping in the kitchen for exactly this kind of work. Through the gap beside the tablecloth, when the wind pushed it aside, she caught a glimpse of the garden. Bean poles down, squash stripped back to its main stems. But there, still vertical. One tomato plant standing under its shattered cloche, bent but refusing the horizontal, having made its decision. Danny, watching her face with the open curiosity of the very young. Your plant made it? Some of them. She turned from the window and looked at Earl Pruitt, who was sitting at the table with his cards and his coffee, and the expression of a man trying very hard to be present in the room, and failing because whatever was happening inside his head was louder than the storm. Morning will tell for certain. Earl stood, reached for his hat. Need to check something in the barn, Caleb. In this? Can't wait. Already at the door. She watched the direction he took when he stepped outside, not toward the barn, toward the bunkhouse, toward the corner where the saddle gear hung on its pegs, where a man would go if he'd decided he was leaving before anyone could stop him. She waited 30 seconds, watching through the tablecloth gap. Then, Mr. Grant, check the cash box. Silas came back from the office with a face like a door that had been shut harder than it should be. $20. Everything I had on hand through the window, in the rain that was finally easing from violent to persistent. Earl Pruitt was in the yard. saddling his horse with the unsteady movements of a man whose hands weren't cooperating, because fear and hurry made them clumsy. Should we? Danny was half out of his chair. No, Hattie poured herself coffee with hands that were shaking slightly, which she registered and found irritating. She'd thought about Earl Pruitt every night since she'd found the second set of entries, and she'd arrived somewhere past anger about it. Anger required energy she could use better elsewhere. Let him go, Danny. But he stole. He did. She sat down, and now he has to live with it. That's not a small thing. Silas stood at the window, watching the gate. His jaw moved with the internal argument he ran silently and thoroughly, and without asking anyone else to referee. She pulled the small ledger from behind the flour canister, where she'd stored it after finding it during her early inventory of the kitchen. Earl's own records, every penny documented, every entry dated, written in the hand of a man who couldn't quite bring himself to stop measuring the distance between what he was doing and what he meant to do. She set it on the table where Silas could see it when he was ready. He picked it up without speaking. Read it standing up as he read things he was serious about. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It changed in the way faces changed when a person expected one thing and found something more complicated. He wrote loan next to every amount. Men tell themselves all kinds of stories to make wrong seem right. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, letting the warmth work into the cuts. The story he was telling himself was that he intended to pay it back. Maybe he did intend to. Maybe at some point the intention became indistinguishable from the belief. It doesn't change what it was. His daughter, Emma. She'd found the girl's name in the supply records from 3 years ago. A medical notation in Ruth Calloway's careful hand for Earl's girl beside a purchase that had nothing to do with ranching. She needs more help than $23 a month can provide. Silas set the ledger down, still watching the dark where Earl had gone, the hoofbeats already swallowed by rain and distance. I knew 6 months ago and didn't act. You didn't know he'd steal. I knew he needed help and I didn't offer it. He turned from the window. Those are different failures, but they both belong to me. She studied him across the kitchen. This man who catalogued his own deficiencies with the same systematic attention he brought to fence lines and column entries, who didn't redirect blame when it belonged on his own ledger. Thomas had done this. Her father had. It was rare enough that she recognized it immediately in people who had it, and noticed immediately in people who didn't. He'll either come back or he won't, she said. Either way, that's tomorrow's accounting. She stood and started clearing the cups, because the storm had passed and the kitchen needed attention, and some problems were better approached after sleep than immediately after crisis. Tonight the barn is secure, the horses are fine, and there's half a pot of coffee left. She was at the counter with her back to the room when he said it. There's something I need to discuss with you. Tomorrow, after church. She turned around. He was standing at the kitchen door with a piece of paper in his hand that he hadn't had before the storm. Not offering it, just holding it, the way people held things they'd been carrying for a while and were deciding whether to set down. What kind of something? She kept her voice even. He looked at the paper, then at her. The kind that changes the arrangement. She waited for the rest. It didn't come. He said goodnight and walked out into the rain that had thinned to a drizzle, leaving her in the kitchen with her bandaged hands, and her cooling coffee and Earl's small ledger with loan written beside every stolen dollar, and the inconvenient, specific awareness that she had let someone become important to her when she had not intended to do any such thing, which was going to require thought. She'd give it thought tomorrow. She went to the window that still had its glass and looked out at the yard. At the road Earl had taken into the dark. Somewhere out there a man was riding away from the only steady work he'd had in years, with a ledger in his saddlebag that documented every dollar he'd borrowed against his own conscience. And on the horizon, barely visible now that the storm had cleared the air, the shape she'd been expecting. The rider, still there, patient in the way of grievances that had decided to wait rather than act, Vernon Shaw, watching the last light go out in the main house. Counting things, Hattie pulled the kitchen curtains and checked the shotgun behind the front door load. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark kitchen for 10 minutes, letting her eyes adjust, watching the window for movement. Nothing came. She went to her quarters, turned the key from the inside, and lay on the narrow bed with her bandaged hands flat on her stomach, and the ceiling above showing the hairline crack she'd noted on day one and had been adding to her mental maintenance list ever since. She thought about a piece of paper that changed the arrangement, about a man who had been carrying it for a while before deciding whether to set it down, and about the specific, irrevocable nature of things that had started producing and what it meant to protect them when the weather came wrong. The rain stopped completely sometime after 2 in the morning, and by 3 the sky had gone clear and star-heavy, the particular clarity that followed violence with calm. She heard the horses at 3:30, not 1:04. Coming fast from the direction of town, which was the direction of Murphy's saloon, which was the direction men came from when they'd spent the evening building themselves up to something they wouldn't have attempted sober. She was at the kitchen window with the shotgun before the gate was open, 4 riders. Shaw in front, weaving in his saddle in the way of a man who was drunk enough to be brave and not yet drunk enough to be incompetent. 3 men behind him. She recognized 2 as Murphy's regulars, men who attached themselves to whoever was buying and called it loyalty. The 3rd was older, uncomfortable in the way of someone who had agreed to come along and was now reassessing the terms. Silas was already in the yard. She didn't know when he'd come out, but he was there, standing at the center of the yard with his arms loose at his sides and no weapon visible, which was either remarkable calm or a specific choice about what statement he wanted to make with his posture. She rested the shotgun barrel on the windowsill. Caleb Voss materialized at the other window with his old revolver, the one she'd noticed he kept cleaned and oiled in the way of a man who hoped not to use it and wanted to be certain he could if he had to. Danny appeared from the bunkhouse doorway with the rifle he'd found during the storm. The other hands spread silently from the bunkhouse into the shadows at the yard's perimeter. They'd done this before. Not this specific thing, but the shape of it, the organization of defense around a central point. It had the practiced quality of people who understood their roles without rehearsal. Evening, Virgil. Silas's voice carried across the yard, flat and unhurried. Bit late for a visit. Came to collect what's mine. Shaw's horse shifted under him. He pulled it straight with the overcorrection of impaired judgment. 8 years I worked this place. 8 years. You give my job to some woman who showed up a month ago with a carpet bag. You forfeited your position when you stole from me. Prove it. Shaw's laugh had a jagged edge. Can't, can you? He pulled folded papers from inside his coat and waved them overhead. You know what I got here? Partnership papers. Filed yesterday at the courthouse. You and that woman and Voss, my job, my place, given away like I was nothing. The courthouse. Yesterday was Saturday. Hattie's mind ran the calendar forward. The papers had been filed Friday, which meant they were public record by Saturday morning, which meant someone who knew to look had found them. Henderson, the bank, or someone at the courthouse itself who had reason to notify Shaw. She'd deal with that later. Those papers are legal and filed. Virgil, you've got no claim here, legal. Shaw spat toward the ground. You know what else is legal? Accidents. Ranch accidents happen all the time. Fires start in barns. Wells get things dropped in them. A man could lose his whole herd in one bad night if somebody wanted it to go that way. The older man behind Shaw, the one who'd been uncomfortable since they rode in, said, Virgil, we came to talk. That's all we came to do. Shut up, Carl. Shaw's attention had moved past Silas, found Hattie's window, found the shape of her behind the glass. 8 years, Western. Sarah treated me like family, fed me at her table, never a harsh word. When she died, what did I get? Nothing, not even a mention in her will. After everything I did, Ruth left her savings to her sister in Ohio. Silas kept his voice even. You knew that. I kept this place running for 2 years after she died. Me, while you were no use to anyone, I held it together. Shaw's voice cracked at the edge. Not from drink, from something rawer than drink. Then one day you decide I'm stealing, throw me out like I never mattered. 8 years, Caleb. 8 years, and you stood there and let him do it. Caleb said nothing. But his silence was not the silence of a man who had no answer. It was the silence of a man who had already given the answer and wasn't going to give it again. Hattie set the shotgun against the window frame, straightened her back, and walked to the kitchen door and opened it and stepped out into the night air before anyone could get ahead of her. The mud from the storm was cold through her boots. Rain had plastered her hair back from her face. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood in the lamplight that came through the kitchen door behind her. Shaw looked at her. The calculations running behind his eyes were visible even at this distance, even in this light. The abandoned bride herself. His voice had gone quieter, which was in some ways more dangerous than the loudness. "Come to defend your new kingdom. Come to make you an offer, Mr. Shaw." She pulled the ledger from her apron pocket. She'd brought it out with her, knowing this moment would come, having prepared for it. "You say you're owed 8 years of building this place. Let's talk about that in numbers." That stopped him. His companions looked at each other. 8 years as foreman, standard wages plus room and board. She opened the ledger to the page she'd prepared. Approximately $9,600 paid in full. Fair wages for fair work. She turned the page. "You stole $600 across your final year. Morrison's records, bank records, your signatures on all of it. But there's something else, Mr. Shaw." His horse shifted. 3 months ago, you sold 15 head of Grant cattle to a buyer in Fort Worth. You recorded them as dead from disease in the ranch books. She held up the page so he could see the numbers in the lamplight. "But dead cattle leave bones. Ruth Calloway recorded every single bone count for the past 3 years. There are no bones for those 15 head, because they weren't dead. You sold them alive and pocketed the money." She closed the ledger. 15 head at $30 each. That's $450, plus the $600. You owe this ranch over $1,000. The older man, Carl, had his horse sideways now. "Virgil, I told you this wasn't. You can't prove the cattle." But Shaw's voice had lost its earlier certainty. "The buyer in Fort Worth has the bill of sale with your signature. The stockyard has the transfer record." She met his eyes directly across the yard. "I wrote to Fort Worth 2 weeks ago requesting confirmation. The reply is already on its way." She had written the letter. It was posted this morning. The reply hadn't arrived yet. But Shaw didn't know the timing, and she'd stated only what was true. She had written, she had requested. The reply was in transit, not a lie. A carefully accurate statement delivered at the most useful moment. "Here's my offer." She kept her voice level and carrying. "Leave tonight. Don't come back. We write off the debt as the severance pay you believe you're owed. Walk away and this stays between us. And if I don't, the Fort Worth documentation goes to Sheriff Morrison Monday morning." Texas takes cattle theft seriously. 5 to 10 years for the amounts involved. Carl's horse was fully turned now. "Virgil, we're leaving." Right now, Shaw pulled the pistol from his holster. His hand was less steady than it would have been an hour ago, which made it more dangerous, not less. The barrel moved between Hattie and Silas in the unfocused way of a drunk man's aim. "Nobody's going anywhere until I drop it." Caleb's voice from the bunkhouse window, the Colt Navy steady. "Right now, Virgil." Shaw turned. Caleb, then Danny at the bunkhouse door with the rifle. Then the shapes of the other hands at the yard's edge, visible now, positioned at the compass points of the space Shaw would need to cover if he decided to make this worse. He counted. He was drunk, but he could still count. The pistol wavered, then went back into the holster, slowly, with the exaggerated care of a man performing control he didn't fully have. "You think you've won something." His voice had gone quiet and mean in the way of a man who would need to believe he was the victim of this story to get up tomorrow. "Women like you don't last. They take what they can and they move on. Everybody out here knows it." "No," Hattie said. "That's what you did, Mr. Shaw. I'm building something." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode out through the gate without looking back. Carl and the others already ahead of him, eager to be clear of the property. The yard held its quiet. Then Caleb. From the bunkhouse window, with the dry precision of a man who had been carrying a thought for a while and had found the right moment. "The sheriff's cousin. Did he really buy those cattle?" Hattie looked at him. "The sheriff's cousin bought cattle 3 months ago. From the Henderson spread, not from this ranch." Caleb absorbed this. "So the Fort Worth confirmation will confirm Shaw sold cattle bearing the Grant brand to a buyer in Fort Worth. Every word I said was true." She turned toward the kitchen door. "I just didn't specify which facts were already in hand and which were in transit." Caleb laughed. Sudden and genuine, the kind of laugh that surprised the person it came from. "He'll figure it out when he sobers up. By then he'll be 2 counties away if he has any sense." She stepped back inside. "He has enough sense. Just not enough character." Silas followed her into the kitchen. The other men dispersed. The specific dispersal of people who had done something difficult together and needed the privacy of their own spaces to let it settle. "He'll come back," Silas said. "He wasn't asking, he might." She sat down and pressed her bandaged hands flat on the table, feeling her pulse in the cuts. But if he comes back with a complaint, the documentation is already in motion. Shaw did sell those cattle. I wrote to Fort Worth 2 weeks ago, and the reply will arrive by midweek. She looked at him. I planned for the possibility from week 1. The only thing I didn't know was when he'd give me the opening to use it. Silas looked at her for a long moment. You rewrapped your hands with fresh cloth, he said. Before you came outside, I saw you do it through the window. She had. I needed to be able to hold the ledger. You came out there with a ledger and bandaged hands and told him every piece of evidence you had against him. And one piece I'm still waiting for. Yes, calculated risk. Everything worth doing is a calculated risk. She stood and started the cleanup that the storm and the confrontation had left behind. Chairs displaced, the tablecloth still nailed over the broken window, coffee cups from the first storm sitting unwashed. The alternative is doing nothing and letting things get worse. I don't find that acceptable. He was quiet while she worked. Then, there's still the matter of that paper I mentioned. Tomorrow, she said, after church. As you said. She handed him a clean cloth without looking up from the dishes. The window board needs securing before morning. The tablecloth will hold the cold out tonight, but it won't survive a wind. He took the cloth. You're not going to ask. I'm going to wait until you're ready to tell me. She stacked the cups. That's different from not asking. He left to secure the window. She finished the dishes and checked the shotgun and turned out the last lamp and went to her room and lay on the narrow bed. And through the window she could see the stars that had come out after the storm cleared the sky. The same stars that had been there on the platform at Caldwell Station. Indifferent to 7 words on a piece of paper and $347 in a corset lining. The same stars that would be there tomorrow, when whatever came next arrived. She slept. The night after the storm smelled like wet earth and something cleared away. Hattie had been awake since 4. Not anxious. Something more precise than that. The specific alertness of a person who knows the next 12 hours matter and wants to meet them with full attention rather than the blurred edges of insufficient sleep. She made coffee before the sky was fully light, stood at the kitchen window with her cup, and watched the dark give way by degrees. Gray first, then the particular rose gold that Texas mornings used when they wanted to be forgiven for what they were about to do with the temperature, the garden. She went out before anyone else stirred. The bean poles were down, which she'd expected. The squash had been stripped back to its main stems, which was a setback rather than a death. Squash were structurally optimistic plants, the kind that treated devastation as a reason to produce more laterals. She'd reset the poles after breakfast. The squash would come back, the tomato plant, still vertical, still bearing its fruit. The mound of earth she'd packed around its base in the rain was intact, compressed by the storm into something almost architectural, and the plant stood in it with the quiet dignity of a thing that had made its decision and held to it. She crouched in the wet garden and looked at it for a long moment, her bandaged hands resting on her knees, the morning light coming flat and honest across the prairie. Some choices were made in the dark. Morning only confirmed them. She went back inside and started breakfast. The hoofbeats came at 5:30, single horse, walking pace. Coming from the south, from the direction of the road that ran toward the county line, which was the direction Earl Pruitt had ridden in the rain the night before. Hattie wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the kitchen window. Silas was already in the yard. She didn't know when he'd come out. She hadn't heard him, which meant he'd been up before her, and moving quietly, which meant he'd been awake and waiting too, which told her something about how he'd spent the hours since the storm. He stood at the gate with his arms loose at his sides and his face doing nothing visible. Which he'd learned when he'd hauled was how he looked as how something was going to go and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Earl Pruitt came through the gate on a horse that had been ridden hard and then walked cool for the past hour. He stopped 10 feet from Cyclus, dismounted without being invited, tied the horse to the post with hands that weren't steady. Not from drink, from the particular unsteadiness that came from spending a night making a decision and arriving at it. He stood with his hat pressed against his chest and his eyes on the ground. He looked like a man who had ridden towards something all night and finally arrived. She went outside. The air was still cool from the rain, the yard muddy but not treacherous. The early light coming sideways and making ordinary things cast longer shadows than they deserved. Caleb Voss was at the bunkhouse door. She'd heard him stir when the hoofbeats came in, heard the creak of the floorboards that meant he was at the window. Danny Ward appeared from behind the barn with the look of someone who'd been doing a task and abandoned it, when the sound of a horse made the task irrelevant. Nobody spoke until Hattie was standing beside Silas. Earl looked up. His eyes found her first. Not because she was the one he owed the most to, but because she was the one who had known. The one who'd seen it in the numbers before he'd made the decision to run, and who had said, apparently loud enough to reach the yard window, "Let him go." He'd heard that. She could see it in his face. He pulled the $20 from his shirt pocket, then a leather pouch from his saddlebag. Set both on the gate post between himself and Silas, $130. His voice had the flat quality of a man who had rehearsed nothing because rehearsing would have let him make it sound better than it was, and he'd decided not to do that. "Everything I took over 2 months. Plus the 20 from last night, plus 10 more. He stopped, restarted, for the betrayal. "The interest on what I broke, not just what I took." Silas looked at the money. "Didn't touch it, Emma." Earl's voice broke on the name, clean through, the way a green board broke. Not a crack, but a complete separation, consumption. "Doctor in Abilene says she needs the dry air treatment, a proper facility, the one in West Texas that handles it right. Clean rooms, proper medical care, the diet they prescribe. $50 a month, and I make 23. He pressed his lips together. "Hard. She's 22 years old. She's all I have left of anything that matters." The yard was very quiet. The kind of quiet that happened when a group of people were listening too carefully to make any sound themselves. Hattie looked at the money on the gatepost, then at Earl's face, the hollowed-out look of a man who had spent a night riding toward accountability and arrived in a state past calculation and into something rawer. She thought about the ledger she'd found behind the flour canister, every entry dated, every amount recorded precisely, every line labeled with the same word. "You kept records," she said. "Couldn't not?" He looked at his own hands, kept thinking if I wrote it down, that meant I still planned to fix it. If I stopped writing it down, that meant I'd stopped believing I could. She considered this. It was not the logic of accounting, her native language, but the logic of a person using documentation as a substitute for the conscience they didn't trust to hold on its own. She'd seen it before, in other books, in other households, the record-keeping of the marginally honest, which was better than the alternative, even if it wasn't good enough to excuse the underlying action. Silas picked up the money, counted it again, slower. "This is $10 extra, I know." Silas looked at him for a long time. Earl looked back. The morning light came across both their faces and said nothing. "You'll stay," Silas said. "Work off the debt proper." Earl's head came up fast, the flinch of a man who had braced for a blow and received a question instead. "After what I did, after what you did and came back to own," Silas pocketed the money. "Emma needs that facility. You need wages. This ranch needs hands who understand what their mistakes actually cost." He paused. "There are conditions. Mrs. Bowman handles the books alone. You don't touch them, don't look at them, don't ask about them unless she brings something to you directly. You account for every cent you spend, every mile you travel, every hour you're away from this property." Earl nodded. His throat worked. "And Emma," Silas looked at the man directly. "Emma writes monthly, tells us how she's doing. We're invested in her recovery now too." Earl stood at the gate post with the look of a man who'd been told grace was available, but wasn't sure he knew how to hold it without dropping it. The others, he looked past Silas at Caleb in the bunkhouse doorway, and Danny near the barn, and the 2 other hands who had materialized from somewhere, because the morning had pulled them toward it. "They won't. Trust gets rebuilt the same way it gets lost," Caleb said from the step, even. Not unkind. The voice of a man who had seen this before and had stopped requiring people to be uncomplicated to find them worth keeping, day by day. "Work by work," Danny nodded. "Once." With the gravity of a young person who had decided this moment deserved his full seriousness, Hattie said, "This ranch was built on second chances. Mine first. Caleb's, in the way that all foremen are trusted before they've proven the trust is warranted. Now yours." She looked at Earl steadily. "Don't make us regret the accounting." He understood that. Numbers were a language he spoke. She'd told him, in his own language, that the ledger was open and she was watching. He nodded, led his horse toward the barn. The yard dispersed, quietly, efficiently, the way things dispersed at the Grant Ranch. Everyone with somewhere to be, everyone with work already 10 minutes overdue. Silas waited until they were alone, which took about 45 seconds. "You knew he'd come back," he said. "Hoped." She started toward the kitchen. Breakfast still needed finishing. Men who keep records of what they've taken aren't lost all the way through. They still have enough conscience left to measure the distance between what they did and what they meant to do. He walked beside her. "That's either very charitable or very shrewd. Those aren't opposites." She pushed the kitchen door open. "The paper you mentioned last night, tonight." After supper he held the door, which he hadn't done before, which she noted without remarking on. When the men are settled, she went into her kitchen and did not argue. She spent the afternoon with the books, properly, completely. Not the investigative pass she'd been running for 2 weeks, looking for anomalies and patterns, but the full accounting work, the kind that turned a chaos of scratched-out numbers into something that told an honest story about where a working ranch stood. The ranch stood better than Silas knew. Men who kept their own books badly often kept them pessimistically, assuming the worst when the figures were unclear rather than working through to the actual number. She found 3 years of evidence on the middleman arrangement, built the case in 3 clean columns, calculated the cumulative cost of 15% where 8 would have been defensible. The number was significant. She wrote it at the bottom of a clean page and circled it twice. She found Ruth Calloway's preservation records too, cross-referenced with supply purchases, and worked out that Ruth had been running the household budget at approximately 20% under market rate through careful seasonal purchasing and an informal trading arrangement with a neighboring ranch that had never been entered into the books properly. Hattie formalized it, added it to the asset column, started a new page headed Improvements Identified, and began the list. By 4 o'clock the kitchen smelled like the apple pie she'd put in the oven at 3, and the books in front of her told a story she suspected Silas Grant had never heard before. That his ranch was more solvent than he believed, that it had been systematically underperforming, not because of bad land or bad cattle, but because of bad record-keeping and one long-running fraud she could now document to the penny. After supper the men went to the bunkhouse. Danny and Earl went together, which was either a peace offering or a supervision arrangement, and was probably both, and either way it was the hands managing themselves, which was what a functional ranch looked like from the inside. Caleb Voss paused at the kitchen door on his way out, looked at Hattie, then at the main room, then back at Hattie, said nothing, touched his hat, left. She interpreted this as his version of "I'm aware of what's developing and I find it acceptable," which she hadn't asked for and didn't need but found she didn't mind receiving. Silas came into the kitchen at 7:30. He set the box on the table, small, wooden. Made from good timber, not decorated, not fancy. Just well joined and carefully finished, the kind of box a man built when he wanted something to last, rather than impress. She'd seen it on the highest shelf in the pantry during her first inventory and had noted it as personal and left it undisturbed. Ruth left this. He kept his hand on the lid for a moment. She said to give it to the woman who made the kitchen a home again. He opened inside. A ring. Not a wedding band, a signet ring, wide and plain, gold-worn soft from decades of contact with a working hand. Initials engraved inside the band. R.C. Ruth Calloway. She wore it 50 years. Her mother before her. Silas took the ring out carefully, set it on the table between them. She called it a kitchen queen's ring. Said the women who ran houses and fed families and held things together through trouble deserved a signet. Same as any man who ever signed a deed. Hattie picked it up, turned it in the lamplight. The gold was the color of old honey, warm rather than bright, worn to the shape of a hand that had worked hard for a long time. She slipped it onto her right ring finger. It fit. Not perfectly, slightly loose against her narrower hand, but settled, the way a thing fit when it had been waiting rather than when it had been made to order. "I'm not Ruth," she said. No, something in his voice was more direct than usual. More deliberate. "You're Hattie Bowman. That's sufficient. More than sufficient." She looked at the ring on her hand for a moment. Then she reached into her apron pocket and took out what she'd been carrying for 5 years. Pressed flat in the back of her mother's ledger. Kept not as a monument to loss, but as a record of what good had looked like, so she'd recognize it again if she was fortunate enough to encounter it. The photograph. Herself, 5 years younger and less settled at the edges, standing beside a tall man in a good coat, both of them looking at the camera with the seriousness of people who knew the photograph would be permanent and wanted to be equal to it. She set it on the table between them, my husband. Thomas Hale. She kept her voice even. Not controlled, which would have meant the evenness was forced, but genuinely level, which meant the subject had become something she could carry without putting down. Died 3 years ago of typhoid in Springfield, Illinois. I was a widow when I answered Holt Briggs's advertisement. Not a maiden, not a fresh start. A woman who had already been married and had learned what good looked like and was looking for it again. Silas looked at the photograph, not at her yet. He looked at Thomas the way he looked at things he was taking seriously, with full attention and without hurry. Why not say, he said. Because men looking for cooks and housekeepers don't often want the one with prior attachments. Because widows are either bad luck or easy marks, depending on who's doing the calculating. She held his gaze when he finally looked up from the photograph. Because I wanted to choose who knew my past, and when she gestured at the ring on her right hand, at the kitchen, at the whole improbable arrangement of the past 3 weeks. And now I own 40% of a working ranch, according to the paper you've been carrying in your vest pocket since before the storm. So the moment seemed right. He went very still. I found it in the books, she said. The legal fees from 3 weeks ago. Henderson's office in town, 1 filing. I know what property partnership registrations cost. I've managed enough household accounts to know the fee schedule. She tilted her head. You filed those papers during my first week here. Before I'd finished proving anything, something moved across his face. Not embarrassment, something more like being seen clearly and deciding, after a moment's consideration, that this was acceptable. I filed them after the first morning, he said. When you came out to the buckboard with your ledger already open and told me what you needed and what you wouldn't accept. He looked at the paper he'd been carrying, still in his hand. I'd been looking at those books for 2 years and making excuses for not knowing how bad they were. You looked at them for 1 night and handed me a summary I could actually use. He set the paper on the table. The ranch needed someone like you. I needed to make sure someone like you had a reason to stay. 40% is a significant reason. It's the honest one. He pushed the paper closer to her. 40%. Caleb holds 10. I keep 50. If something happens to me, illness, accident, anything, you and Caleb inherit equal shares. Witnessed and filed, she read it. Her name at the top, the legal language she had to read twice to be certain she understood its full scope. Why equal with Caleb on inheritance? Because Caleb has been here 6 years and never taken a dollar that wasn't his and never will. And because you'll need someone who knows the land if you're managing the books. He paused. And because it's right. That's the main reason. She looked at the paper for a long time, at her name in the legal language that the state of Texas would be obliged to honor. At the figure that meant she could not be made homeless by a death or by departure or a brother-in-law with a lawyer, because the law that had once been used against her would now have to stand in front of her instead. Yes, she said. He nodded once, with the nod that meant something had been received and would be acted on. Then he reached into his vest pocket. The ring was thin, gold worn to a wire almost, the years having taken the substance while leaving the shape intact. His mother's hand had been smaller than his, which meant it was close to Hattie's size. She understood what it was before he said a word. I've been carrying this for 3 weeks, he said. Since the morning I found you building with broken boards and the wrong wood and no tools to speak of. He set it on the table next to the partnership papers. Not placing it on her hand, setting it down, the way he'd set the brass key on the flat rock outside the Hullbrook place 3 weeks ago. Giving her the choice. Always giving her the choice. We're already partners in the business of this ranch, already working side by side, already trusting each other with the things that matter. That's a very practical framing of a proposal, she said. That's because there's a practical case and a different case, and both are true. He moved around the table, not hurrying, crossing the distance between the door and where she stood with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything. Frame corners and harness checks, and the care required when handling something that could break if you weren't paying attention. The practical case is that we work well together. The ranch is better for both of us running it, and the legal arrangement would protect you in ways the partnership papers alone don't fully cover. And the different case. He was close enough now that she could see the concentration lines around his eyes that deepened when he was being careful about something. The different case is that 4 years ago, I stopped letting myself think about what it might be like to have someone working beside me instead of alone, because I'd decided I wasn't the kind of man who got that twice. That once was the allowance I'd been given and I'd spent it. He looked at her steadily. And then you walked into my yard and started building something out of nothing, and knew immediately when a corner was wrong and fixed it without being asked. And I started thinking I might have been wrong about the allowance. Hattie looked at the ring on the table, at the partnership papers, at her own hands, the right one with Ruth Calloway's gold on the ring finger, the left one still bare, the hand she'd kept empty for 3 years because she'd been honest enough with herself to know she wasn't ready to fill it. She picked up his mother's ring. "What about the part where the love grows?" she said. Something in his eyes shifted. "My mother said it grew slow, like things that were built to last rather than built to impress." He was very still, waiting. "She said it went down before it went up. Roots first. The visible part came later. She was right about most things. From what you've told me, she was right about all of it." A pause. "She built something from nothing, too." With $14 and a trunk full of books, Hattie put the ring on left hand, the hand she'd kept empty. It settled next to nothing, because there was nothing else on that hand, and it sat there with the quiet authority of a thing that had found the right place after a long time in a pocket. "Well then, Mr. Grant," she was almost entirely steady. "Almost. I believe we have a wedding to plan." "Why wait, not a question." Storms passed. "Reverend Walsh is in town. We have 8 witnesses." He paused. "I already have the marriage license. Got it from the county clerk Friday morning before I filed the partnership papers." She looked at him. "I planned for the possibility," he said. The corner of his mouth moved. "That's different from expecting." She almost laughed. And then she did, briefly, which startled her, because she hadn't expected the feeling of lightness that came with it, and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. 9 witnesses, she said, when she had herself back. "If Earl stays..." She looked past him toward the window that still had its glass. Outside, in the lamplight from the bunkhouse, she could see Earl Pruitt sitting on the step with Danny Ward. The two of them talking in the low way people talked when they were working something out between themselves. Earl's head was bowed. Danny was listening with the full attention that young people gave when they were deciding what kind of person they were going to be about something. When Silas turned to look, Earl glanced up and met his eyes through the window. Earl nodded, small, slow, with the gravity of a man who understood what being included meant after forfeiting the right to it. Sunday came in clean. The storm damage was visible everywhere. Missing shingles, a section of fence leaning at an angle it hadn't chosen, the remnants of bean poles still tangled in the garden rows. But the sky was the specific blue that Texas produced after rain cleared it thoroughly. The kind of blue that looked like it went all the way through to something on the other side, and the air had the clean precision that followed violence with calm. Reverend Walsh arrived at 7:30, sent for Saturday evening by Danny Ward, who had apparently gone to town on his own initiative the moment Silas mentioned a wedding was being considered. Hattie had not known this was possible to arrange in under 12 hours. She was revising her estimates of Danny Ward upward on a weekly basis. They gathered in the main room at 8 in the morning, 8 men in their Sunday clothes, which for working hands meant clean shirts and combed hair, and in Danny's case, boots that had been polished with evident genuine effort and some kind of grease that was probably not boot polish, but had achieved a similar effect through sheer determination. Earl stood at the end of the line, back straight, his hat in his hands, not absent, not hiding in the bunkhouse, present, in the line, because Hattie had said 9 witnesses and he was going to be the 9th. Caleb Voss stood at the front, which was his right as foreman, and which he occupied with the quiet authority of a man who knew his role and found it sufficient. Hattie wore the blue dress, the one from the platform at Caldwell Station, the one that had been present for all of it, the 7 words on the paper, the walk to Mrs. Alcott's boarding house, the road out to the Hullbrook place, the first morning with the broken boards. She'd worn it through the most difficult 12 hours of her adult life, and she wore it here, and that felt right. Felt like the continuity you built on purpose when you wanted to remember where you'd started. She stood next to Silas Grant in the main room of their house, 40% of it legally hers, all of it in the ways that couldn't be filed at the courthouse, and listened to the vows. She had said these words before. She had heard these words before. They were the same words, in the same order, in the same voice of a man reading from the same worn Bible. And they were entirely different from the last time. Not because the ceremony had changed, but because she had, and because the man beside her was not Thomas, was not a replacement for Thomas, was not a consolation for Thomas, but was entirely himself, and she was choosing him on that basis, with clear eyes and no remainder of delusion about what she was or wasn't getting. "I take you." She said it. Meant it in the way she meant things she'd thought through carefully and arrived at by honest process. He said his. Quietly, directly, without performance, looking at her in the way he looked at things he was serious about. With full attention and without hurry. The ring was already on her hand. Danny Ward made a sound. It would become, in years of retelling, a dignified expression of appropriate celebration. In the moment, it was the uncontrolled expression of a 19-year-old who had let himself feel things and had no available mechanism for keeping those feelings in the socially acceptable range. Caleb put his hand on Silas's shoulder for exactly 1 second. That was all. It was sufficient. James Fowler, who had perhaps said 60 words in her presence across 3 weeks, produced a flask from his inside coat pocket, looked at it, looked at the Reverend, and put it back. Earl Pruitt looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked up, and there was something in his face that she had not seen in there in the days she'd been watching him. Not relief exactly, not happiness exactly, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both, and was possibly the beginning of believing that belonging was still available to a man who had broken faith with the place he belonged. The ceremony was over in 12 minutes. They were at the breakfast table, all of them, the whole improbable collection of them, when the Alcott buggy appeared in the yard, which was inconvenient. Because Hattie had been eating biscuits and feeling, for the first time in recent memory, genuinely uncomplicated, Mr. Alcott climbed down from the buggy with the expression of a man on an errand he hadn't volunteered for. His wife stayed in the vehicle, which communicated its own message clearly enough. From Judge Morrison, Alcott said, handing the envelope to Silas, arrived Saturday evening by special courier. Silas opened it, read it, handed it to Hattie without comment. She read it. Holt Briggs and Dora Briggs versus Hattie Bowman. Breach of contract. Seeking damages for expenses incurred in bringing aforementioned Hattie Bowman to Texas under representations of forthcoming marriage. Stage ticket, $40. Board and promised accommodations, $20. Emotional distress and damages, $100. She almost laughed. She kept it internal, because there were people watching, and she needed her face to do something useful rather than something honest. "He's suing me," she said. "For emotional distress, from the buggy." Mrs. Alcott's voice arrived with the precision of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this gap in the conversation. "You've certainly stirred things up, Mrs. Bowman. Or is it, miss? There does seem to be some confusion about your situation." Hattie set the letter on the table. Stood, walked to the edge of the porch with the measured pace of someone who had already decided what she was going to say and was simply closing the distance to the audience. "It's Mrs. Grant." Her voice was carrying without being raised. "Married this morning, witnessed by 8 people, officiated by Reverend Walsh. Licensed by the county clerk of Caldwell County as of Friday last." She let that settle. "Any other questions about my situation you'd like answered in the open air, Mrs. Alcott?" Mrs. Alcott's mouth opened, closed, opened again without producing language. "Monday morning," Alcott said, looking at Silas because old habits required time to revise. 9 o'clock. Judge Morrison's office. "We won't be late," Hattie said. Not Silas. The buggy left. She went back inside and picked up her biscuit. Caleb looked at her. She looked back. "Well," Danny said, into the silence that followed. "That's a thing." Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Judge Morrison's office was small and smelled like old paper, and the specific leather polish that courthouses used, because it communicated seriousness without requiring the furniture to do additional work. Morrison himself was 60, lean, with the evaluating eyes of a man who had listened to every available kind of story and had developed a reliable methodology for sorting the honest ones from the constructed ones. Holt Briggs was already there when they arrived. He'd worn his best clothes, which were better than Hattie had expected. A suit that wasn't new but had been maintained, which told her he'd either borrowed it or owned it from a period when his circumstances were different. He had the posture of a man who expected to win, which was either confidence or a failure to understand the situation he was walking into. Dora Briggs stood beside him. Her eyes found Hattie first, then Silas, then Hattie's left hand, then back to Hattie's face, doing the accounting that people did when they were measuring a situation they hadn't fully prepared for. Hattie set 3 items on Morrison's desk. Her mother's ledger, open to the correspondence section. 14 months of letters she'd kept, each one dated and organized, because she was a bookkeeper and she kept records of everything that carried weight. A copy of Texas breach of promise statute, written out from the legal reference book she'd asked to use in Morrison's own office on Thursday afternoon. Granted without question because a woman requesting access to a law book looked like research and people didn't look twice at research. And her accounting of damages, prepared Saturday evening with the same methodical attention she brought to the ranch books. Morrison looked at the 3 items, looked at Holt, looked at Hattie. Mr. Briggs has filed for $160, Morrison said. Mrs. Grant, you're representing yourself? I am. She folded her hands on the desk. I'd like to respond to the claim and enter a counterclaim for the record. Holt's lawyer, a young man from Wichita who'd been practicing for 2 years and looked it, straightened in his chair. The claim is for $160, Hattie said. Stage ticket, promised board, and emotional distress. She opened the ledger to the correspondence section. Mr. Briggs sent 14 letters over 11 months. I have them here, each dated, each making specific representations. She set the first 3 on Morrison's desk. In the letter of March 12th, he describes ownership of a 120-acre ranch, free and clear of any debt. In the letter of July 8th, he describes a 4-room house with a reliable well and a working kitchen garden. She placed 2 more letters. In the letter of October 3rd, 2 months before my arrival date, he confirms his intentions explicitly and requests that I advance my own travel costs, which he undertakes to reimburse upon my arrival. Morrison was reading. His expression was the expression of a man finding what he expected to find and taking no particular pleasure in the confirmation. Under Texas breach of promise statute, Hattie continued, the aggrieved party may claim damages for travel, time lost, and financial opportunity forfeited as a direct result of the broken promise and the representations made in support of it. She placed her accounting sheet on top of the letters. Stage ticket to Caldwell, one way, $40. 2 weeks of boarding while establishing alternative employment, at the rate I was paying Mrs. Alcott, $7. Wages for gun during the period of reliance on Mr. Briggs's representations, calculated against my documented prior wage rate in Springfield. $340, she paused. Total counterclaim, $387. More than double Mr. Briggs's original filing. The room held its quiet. Holt's lawyer looked at Holt. Holt looked at the counterclaim figure with the expression of a man who had walked through a door, expecting one room and found another room entirely, and then found a 3rd room behind that, however. Hattie said. Morrison looked up. I'm choosing not to file the counterclaim. She took the accounting sheet back and folded it. Mr. Briggs's $40 paid for a stage ticket that delivered me to a town where I found work, found partners I trust, and found a life that is better in every material and immaterial way than the one I was traveling toward when I bought that ticket. She looked at Holt directly, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the factual clarity of a woman who had already closed the account and was explaining the final balance as a courtesy. Consider it the fare for the right destination, even if the itinerary was wrong. She was done. Morrison looked at Holt's lawyer. The lawyer looked at his papers with the focused attention of a man who had nothing on them that would help, and was hoping that looking busy would buy him time to think of something. Nothing came, Mr. Briggs. Morrison's voice carried the conclusion he'd reached approximately 4 minutes into the proceeding. The counterclaim alone would exceed your original filing by a margin that would not reflect well on the filing. I note that Mrs. Grant has the documentation to support every figure she cited. He set his pen down with the finality of a man who was done. I'm dismissing the case. You may refile if you choose. I would recommend against it. Holt sat very still for a moment. The look on his face was not the look of a man who had simply lost a legal proceeding. It was the look of a man who had finally seen the full distance between where he was and where he had imagined himself to be, and found the distance significantly larger than expected. He stood, did not look at Hattie, Walked out with the deliberate care of a man managing his dignity by keeping his pace even. His lawyer followed, carrying his papers under his arm. Dora remained 3 seconds longer than she needed to, standing in the small office with her hands at her sides, and then she moved toward the door and stopped. Mrs. Grant? Her voice was low enough that only Hattie and Silas, closest to her, could hear. I should have made him write to you properly. Before you made that trip, the ring on her finger still the same thin brass. Still telling the same story about the promises it represented. I told him to. He said. She stopped. The familiar stop. He said let her figure it out herself, and I did. Hattie said it without weight, without warmth, without cruelty. Just the fact, clean and complete. I figured it out very well. Dora received this. Nodded once. The nod of a woman delivering a verdict on herself that she'd already reached in private and was only now saying aloud. She left. Silas said nothing until they were on the boardwalk outside. The Monday morning sun doing its business overhead with the confidence of something that had been at it long enough not to need acknowledgement. You wrote out the statute from memory, from Morrison's reference book. Thursday afternoon, she turned toward the buckboard. I asked to use his library for research, and he said yes without asking why. You planned the counterclaim before the lawsuit existed. I planned for the possibility that Holt Briggs was the kind of man who would look for someone to blame when his choices produced consequences. Most men like that are. She stepped up to the buckboard seat. The counterclaim wasn't ever going to be filed. It was leverage. I needed him to understand the full shape of his exposure before Morrison dismissed the case, so that he'd understand why refiling was not in his interest. Silas climbed to his side, gathered the reins, and if he'd called your bluff, it wasn't a bluff. Every number I cited was accurate and documented. She settled on the seat. I just didn't want to spend the next 6 months in a legal proceeding about a man who wasn't worth 6 days of my attention. He was quiet for a moment, the horses moving at a walk through the Monday morning street. Then, you are the most organized person I've ever encountered. She considered this. Is that? The most complete compliment I know how to give. No qualification. No amendment. They were at the edge of town, the road opening up ahead of them into the familiar grass and sky. When the deputy appeared on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, Mr. Grant, he touched his hat. Got a complaint and filed Saturday morning by Vernon Shaw, says Mrs. Grant. He looked at Hattie, then back at Silas, adjusting to the new name with the practical speed of a man who dealt with name changes regularly. Says Mrs. Grant made false accusations against him and threatened him on Grant Ranch property. Once charges considered, Silas began to respond. Hattie opened her bag. She took out a folded document. 2 pages, both written in a clear formal hand, with a Fort Worth Livestock Exchange letterhead at the top of the first page. She set it on the railing between herself and the deputy. Transfer confirmation, she said. 15 head of cattle bearing the Grant Ranch brand, transferred to a buyer in Fort Worth 6 months ago. The seller's signature is Vernon Shaw's. The date of transfer corresponds to the same week those animals were recorded as dead from disease in the Grant Ranch books. She watched the deputy unfold and begin reading. I wrote to the Fort Worth stockyard, requesting confirmation of the transfer and copies of the signed documents. This arrived Friday afternoon, the deputy read. Read again. Looked up. The original letter was posted 2 weeks ago, Hattie said. Before Mr. Shaw's visit to the ranch Saturday night. I'd been expecting the reply for several days. She had written the letter 2 weeks ago. On the same Saturday morning she'd posted the letter requesting the information. The morning of her first town trip, the morning she'd confirmed Shaw's fraud at Morrison's and the bank. She had been building this case alongside the Earl Pruitt case and the book correction simultaneously, in the parallel columns that were her natural mode of working. The reply had arrived Friday. She had read it Friday evening. She had put it in her bag Saturday morning before the storm. She had been ready. I'll be paying Mr. Shaw a visit, the deputy said. He folded the document and tucked it under his arm, touched his hat. To both of them, she noted. To her and to Silas equally. The cattle theft charge alone is enough to warrant a conversation. He went back inside. Silas looked at her from the buckboard seat as they pulled away from the rail. He had the expression of a man recalibrating an estimate he'd already revised upward 3 times. From the beginning, he said. Not a question. From the possibility. She tucked her bag back under the seat. There's a difference between planning for something and expecting it. I plan for everything. I expect what The evidence supports. They drove out of Caldwell in the Monday morning light, the road ahead straight and clear, the grass on both sides of it moving in a light wind that had none of the violence of the previous night. What does the evidence support? He said. Currently, she thought about it honestly, the way she thought about all questions that deserved honest answers. More than I expected, she said. When I stepped off that stage with a carpet bag and 7 words on a piece of paper, she watched the Grant Ranch appear on the low rise ahead of them, solid and square against the sky, considerably more. 6 months later, January in Texas was its own particular season. Not the brutal winter of the states further north, but a season with its own seriousness, cold enough to be honest, clear enough to see far. The light came in low and white, and made ordinary things cast shadows longer than they deserved, and the morning air had the crystalline quality of something that had decided to be precise. Hattie stood at the kitchen window, at first light with her coffee, both hands around the cup. The cuts from the storm had healed months ago, but the scar tissue across her right palm still pulled slightly in the cold, a reminder she'd decided to keep rather than resent. The same way she kept Thomas's photograph in the back of her ledger, rather than removing it, because removing it would have meant pretending a thing hadn't been, and she had never been interested in that kind of accounting. The ranch in January was different from the ranch in August. Not quieter, different the way a well-run place was different in its slow season from its busy one. The maintenance work that summer didn't permit. The repairs to the east fence line that James Fowler was working through methodically, one section at a time, with the focused patience of a man who had decided the fence was going to be right by spring, regardless of how long it took. The books were clean. 3 months running, clean columns, every entry documented, every discrepancy explained and resolved. The middleman arrangement on the cattle sales had been renegotiated. She'd handled it herself in writing, with the documented evidence of 3 years of overcharging attached, and the new rate was 8%, which was fair to both parties and more than fair to the Grant Ranch specifically. She'd added the annual savings to the improvement ledger and started a column for what to do with them. Earl Pruitt was at the north fence line by 6 in the morning, because that was where the work was, and because he arrived first to the work now, consistently, without being asked or observed. The shift had happened gradually, not a conversion, not a performance of redemption, just a man doing what he'd said he would do, day after day, until the days accumulated into something that resembled a track record. Emma's letter had come last Tuesday. 3 pages, written in a hand that was stronger than the previous months. The doctor had noted improvement in her lung capacity, measurable improvement, the kind that the dry air treatment produced when it was working. She was teaching again. 2 hours a day with 3 children who were patients at the same facility. Working through reading and arithmetic with the stubborn cheerfulness of a 22-year-old who had decided that being ill was not going to be the primary fact about her. Hattie had read the letter twice, filed it in the folder she'd started for Emma's correspondence. The folder was 3 months thick. Danny Ward had turned 20 in November. Caleb had given him responsibility for the East Pasture management. Not a title, just the responsibility, which was Caleb's way of saying prove it before we put it in writing. Danny was proving it. He came to Hattie once a week with his pasture accounts, laid them out on the kitchen table, and waited for her to find what he'd missed. The first week she'd found 4 things. The second week 2. Last week nothing, and she'd told him so. And he'd looked at the ledger for a long moment and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been working towards something and had just arrived. Caleb appeared at the kitchen door at 6:10 with the morning cattle count, which was the same number it had been yesterday and would be the same number tomorrow unless something changed. But Caleb counted anyway, because that was the discipline that kept small problems from becoming large ones. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She poured him coffee without being asked, because she always poured him coffee and he always accepted it, and they had been doing this for 6 months, and neither of them needed to acknowledge that it had become a custom. He drank it standing at the door, looking out at the yard the way men who spent their lives outdoors looked at yards, not seeing what was there but what was different from yesterday. "Letter from Emma Pruitt," she said, on the table. "Her lungs are improving," he nodded. "Read it standing up, the way she'd learned people read things they were serious about. Set it back down carefully." "Good." Yes, he finished his coffee, set the cup on the counter, and went back out into the January morning. Silas came in through the back door at 6:15. He'd been at the barn since 5. She'd heard him go out, heard the barn door, heard the specific sounds of a man checking on horses in the way that men who cared about horses checked on them, attentively and without hurry. He came in and closed the door and stood in the kitchen with the quality of presence that she'd noticed about him from the beginning. Not filling a space in the sense of taking it up, but settling into it, the way something fit correctly. He looked at her face, she looked back. "Emma's letter," he said, on the table. "She's teaching again." He read it where Caleb had left it, set it back down. "She wants to visit in spring, when the weather allows. We'll make room, not we'll see, or if she's well enough, or any of the qualified constructions that were really just polite ways of saying maybe. We'll make room, as though the question of space was the only practical one, and it was already answered. She had learned in 6 months of being in close proximity to Silas Grant that this was how he was with things he'd decided about. Not dramatic about the deciding, not requiring acknowledgement or discussion once the decision was made. Just decided, and then acting accordingly, and leaving the announcement implicit in the actions that followed. It was a very efficient system. She respected it entirely. It still caught her off guard sometimes, which she also respected, because she didn't want to stop being surprised by good things. She had been surprised by too many bad ones for too long to take the good ones as a matter of course. He came to stand beside her, at the window, not touching. Just beside, the proximity that had become their habitual language for "I am here and aware of you without requiring you to do anything about it." It had evolved without being negotiated, which was how the best arrangements evolved. "The shelter," he said. She looked at him, by the creek. He was looking out the window toward the low ground, where the old Hullbrook lumber structure still stood, still sound, despite everything the fall weather had brought through. "I've been thinking about it. It's held through a storm and 3 months of weather. It held because the framing was right from the start." He said this with the same tone he used when he was stating a thing that mattered to him, which was his version of emphasis. Not louder, more deliberate. The framing was good. It just needs the rest built around it. She understood what he was saying. She chose to hear the literal version until she was ready for the other one. We'd need different lumber. The Hullbrook boards have weathered past what's useful. I know where to get good pine. The corner of his mouth moved. I know a mill. She looked out at the shelter in the winter light, solid and square. Still the first thing they'd built together, still standing. She put her hand over his where it rested on the windowsill. His hand turned under hers, and their fingers found the arrangement they'd found over 6 months of proximity. Easy and without requirement. "I need to go to Abilene in March," she said. "There's a doctor there, Dr. Harmon, best in the region for the kind of consultation I need." Silas went very still, not the working still, not the calculating still. The other kind, the kind that meant information had arrived and the person receiving it needed a moment to let it become real in the full sense rather than just the understood sense. "March," he said. "I wanted to be sure first." She held his gaze, steady and direct, because this was the thing she'd decide to do differently. Not to wait for certainty before saying anything. Not to protect him from the possibility of disappointment at the cost of carrying the weight alone. "I'm sure enough. The signs have been clear for 6 weeks." She paused. "July, if the timing holds." He was very quiet. The kitchen held the silence the way good structures held weight. Distributed evenly, without strain, the kind of silence that had room in it for whatever needed to happen next. And then something moved through his face that she had not seen move through it before. Not the almost smile, not the warmth she'd come to recognize in his eyes when he looked at her. Something larger than both of those things combined. Something that moved through him the way weather moved through open country, changing the whole landscape it crossed. "This time," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which she found she did not mind at all. "This time I'll know from the beginning." She understood what he meant. She had understood it since the day he'd told her about Margaret and the baby that was 3 months along, and the doctor who had told him afterward, and the 4 years he'd spent not knowing what he'd lost. The 4 years of wondering whether he was the kind of man a person told things to before they were certain. "You are," she said. "You have been since before I could prove it." She looked at him steadily. She knew it too, I think. She was just careful with you, the way you're careful with things that matter. That's not doubt, that's how she held something precious. He looked at her for a long moment with the direct attention that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him. On the day he'd crouched beside her bad corner brace and showed her with his hands how weight distributed down instead of sideways. His hand found her face, briefly, with the specific gentleness of someone who had learned to be careful with things that mattered. You're going to keep the books through July, he said. Through August, she moved to the stove, because breakfast didn't make itself, and the men would be in from the morning work in 40 minutes. And this was how their days were structured, and she found she did not want it structured any other way. I work better with something to do, I know. He sat down at the kitchen table, which was his custom when she was cooking, present but not in the way. I have the lumber order to finalize this week for the shelter repairs. Start with the corners, she said, without turning from the stove. That's where everything holds or fails. I know. I'm aware that you know. She turned to look at him over her shoulder. I'm saying it anyway. He picked up the pen from beside the ledger she'd left open and started on the lumber order, and she turned back to the stove, and outside the ranch went about its January morning. Earl at the north fence with a post driver and the focused patience of a man building himself back the way you built anything, one correct thing at a time. Danny in the east pasture with his count book and his improving arithmetic. Kate checking the water situation at the creek crossing. With the thoroughness of a man who had been doing this work long enough to check things that hadn't caused problems yet, because he understood that was how you kept them from causing problems. The morning light came across the prairie flat and clean and entirely honest, the way it did in January when there was nothing left in the air to diffuse it. Through the window, barely visible in the low light, the shelter by the creek still stood. The first thing built, still square, still true at every corner. By July there would be someone else in the house. By spring, Emma Pruitt would be well enough to travel. By March, the east fence would be properly repaired, and the lumber order would be in, and the books would be cleaner than they'd been in the ranch's history. And the middleman would be getting 8%, where he'd been getting 15%, and the improvement column would have enough in it to start the conversation about what came next. The stove was warm, the coffee was strong, the ledger on the table was open to a clean page. Hattie Bowman had arrived in Texas with a cartback, a rifle, and $347 sewn into her corset lining, and a man who hadn't even had the decency to sign his name to the 7 words that ended 14 months of careful hoping. She had built a frame from broken boards and the wrong wood and no proper tools. She had built a kitchen back into a home and a set of books back into an honest record, and a collection of men back into something that resembled a family. She had built, with full knowledge of what it cost and full willingness to pay it, a life that had her name on it in a way the law was required to honor. Some things ought to leave marks, remind you of the price of building something real, and some things, the right things built correctly from the corners outward, were built to last.